Some killers bury their victims. Others burn them. Cesar Barone tried to erase his entirely and almost succeeded. He smiled at cameras. He worked beside neighbors. And beneath his basement floor, bodies waited in silence. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where the stories get darker and the truth cuts deeper. Tonight, we're delving into 4 chilling crime stories. I'm glad you're here. If you enjoy these late-night truths, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. This is the story of the erased face. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Thank you. We're tracking a predator who weaponized normalcy, a man who understood that the best camouflage isn't darkness, it's daylight. Cesar Barone didn't hide in shadows. He hid behind handshakes, job applications, and the kind of forgettable face that dissolves in memory the moment you turn away. But what he buried beneath concrete and lime wasn't just evidence. It was proof that monsters don't announce themselves with fangs and claws. They show up on time. They say please and thank you. And when you're not looking, they drag you into a hell so meticulously constructed that even your bones won't remember your name. Hillsboro, Oregon, 1995. Rain hammered the pavement like accusations, turning streets into mirrors that reflected a town beginning to fracture. 3 women had vanished within months, dissolving from their lives as if reality itself had decided to edit them out. No ransom calls, no bodies, no witnesses who saw anything worth remembering. Just absences that grew louder with each passing week. The investigation had gone cold in the particular way cases do when there's nothing to chase. No blood trails, no breadcrumb evidence, just names on missing person reports and families who couldn't stop checking their phones. Detectives worked leads that crumbled like wet paper. Searches turned up nothing but false hope and wasted overtime. The women had simply stepped off the edge of the known world, and Hillsboro held its breath, waiting for answers that refused to come. But evil doesn't rest. It renovates. Cesar Francesco Barone moved through this anxious landscape with the unremarkable quality of furniture. Present, functional, utterly forgettable. 40 years old, average height, thinning hair, the kind of man you'd pass in a grocery store aisle without a second glance. He worked odd jobs with the quiet competence of someone who understood that visibility was a liability. Landscaping, light construction, tasks that required hands but not conversation. He rented a house on Southeast 182nd Avenue, a modest structure that broadcast respectability through its very ordinariness. Neighbors knew him as polite but distant, the kind of tenant landlords loved. Rent always on time, no complaints, no drama. What they didn't know was that Cesar Francesco Barone wasn't his real name. The man living in that unremarkable house had been born Adolph James Road 3 in 1952. Inheriting not just a name but a blueprint for violence. His father, Adolph James Road 2, had been convicted of murder in 1958, executing his crime with the cold precision that would later echo in his son's methodology. Heredity isn't destiny, but in this case, it was prophecy. The younger Road grew up marinated in dysfunction, watching his family tree produce nothing but poisoned fruit. By adolescence, he'd already logged arrests for assault. By his 20s, he'd graduated to sexual violence, attacking women with the calculated brutality of someone testing boundaries, seeing what he could get away with. In 1979, those experiments ended in conviction. Road was sentenced to 14 years for rape in Washington state, entering a correction system that promised rehabilitation but delivered only interrupted opportunity. He served his time with the same unremarkable efficiency he brought to everything else. No incidents worth noting, no behaviors that triggered alarm. Model prisoner, the kind of inmate who makes parole boards feel good about their decisions. They released him in 1993. 2 years later, women started disappearing. But Cesar Barone, the identity he'd constructed from stolen paperwork and manufactured history, had learned something crucial during those prison years. He'd learned that the system wasn't designed to catch people like him. It was designed to process obvious threats, to react to visible violence. If you stayed beneath the threshold of attention, if you mastered the performance of normalcy, you could operate with near impunity. All you needed was patience, planning, and the understanding that suspicion requires evidence, and evidence can be destroyed. His hunting ground was the vulnerable ecosystem of women living on society's margins. Sex workers, addicts, women whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger massive investigations because their lives already existed in the spaces between official concern. He understood, with predatory clarity, that some victims are mourned less loudly than others, that some absences create smaller ripples, that if you chose carefully, you could kill almost invisibly. Chanti Woodman was 29 when she encountered him. She worked the streets, surviving day by day in the grinding poverty that makes people invisible to those who don't want to see. Martha Bryant, 23, carried similar burdens: addiction, desperation, the kind of life that rarely makes headlines until it ends. Beth Wilmot, another young woman navigating the same dangerous landscape. They didn't know each other, these women who would eventually be linked by their shared destroyer. They didn't know that accepting a ride, entertaining a client, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time would connect them in death in ways life never had. Barone approached each encounter with the methodical preparation of a craftsman. He didn't improvise. He didn't rely on opportunity alone. He created scenarios, built traps disguised as transactions, offered something these women desperately needed: money, safety, shelter, and then closed the cage. What happened in those final moments remains partially obscured by the simple fact that his victims can't testify. But evidence would later speak in their silence, telling stories of violence so extreme it suggested not rage but procedure. He killed the way accountants balance books, systematically, thoroughly checking his work. And then came the disposal, the phase where Barone's true innovation emerged. He didn't dump bodies in remote locations where hikers might stumble across them. He didn't rely on rivers or forests to consume his evidence. He brought them home, to the house on Southeast 182nd Avenue, where neighbors saw nothing unusual because there was nothing unusual to see. Just a quiet tenant living a quiet life. Beneath his rental property, accessible through the basement, he'd created a tomb that doubled as a chemistry experiment. He understood decomposition, understood that bodies are evidence only as long as they remain bodies. Lime accelerates the process, breaking down organic material, speeding the transformation from person to residue. He buried them there. Beneath concrete he poured himself, creating a foundation that was also a grave marker. Each burial made the house more his, turned it into a monument to his own perceived brilliance. He was building something down there in the dark, not just hiding crimes, but constructing proof of his superiority over the system that had once caged him. Every body successfully hidden was a middle finger to law enforcement, to society, to everyone who'd ever underestimated the quiet man with the forgettable face. But Caesar Barone made the mistake every intelligent criminal eventually makes. He assumed his intelligence made him invincible. He forgot that confidence breeds carelessness, and carelessness creates cracks. The cracks were about to split wide open. Seattle, Washington, March 1995. 3 months before Hillsborough would begin counting its missing women, Barone was in another city, wearing another temporary identity, living another forgettable life. He'd taken a job at a Firestone tire shop, the kind of blue-collar work that required competence but not conversation. Show up on time, do the work, collect the paycheck, disappear. Perfect camouflage. His coworker was a young woman named Martha Costerzua, 27 years old, working to support herself, navigating the ordinary challenges of adult life with no awareness that she was sharing workspace with a predator who'd already killed and would kill again. She was friendly in the casual way coworkers are. Small talk during breaks, polite acknowledgement in passing. Normal interactions in what seemed like a normal environment. Barone watched her the way scientists observe specimens. He noted her routines, her vulnerabilities, the moments when she was alone. He began constructing scenarios in his mind, testing different approaches, gaming out possibilities. This was his process, meticulous observation followed by careful planning. He didn't strike impulsively. He engineered opportunities. But something went wrong. The details remain disputed, lost in the fog of conflicting testimonies and suppressed evidence. But what's certain is this: Martha Kosterzua rejected him. Whether it was a romantic advance she rebuffed, a proposition she refused, or simply a perception of disrespect that his fractured psychology couldn't tolerate, something triggered the violence he usually reserved for his carefully selected victims. On March 22, 1995, Barone attacked Martha in a storage area of the Firestone shop. He brought a weapon, a hammer that most mundane of tools transformed into an instrument of annihilation. He struck her repeatedly, each blow carrying the weight of rage that had been simmering beneath his manufactured normalcy. The attack was frenzied but not random. Even in fury, there was methodology. He meant to kill her. He meant to silence her permanently. Martha Kosterzua should have died in that storage room. The severity of her injuries suggested that death was the only logical outcome. Skull fractures, brain trauma, the kind of damage that erases consciousness and, frequently, life itself. Barone left her there, believing he'd completed the task, confident that by the time anyone found her, she'd be beyond testimony. But Martha Kosterzua refused to cooperate with his narrative. She survived, barely, clinging to life with a tenacity that would later seem prophetic. She held on through the critical hours when most victims succumbed to their injuries. Emergency responders rushed her to surgery. Doctors worked with the desperate intensity reserved for cases where minutes determine outcomes. Against astronomical odds, Martha lived. And she remembered. Not everything. Traumatic brain injury creates permanent shadows in memory, but enough. She remembered her attacker. She remembered the face that had seemed so unremarkable in their daily interactions. She remembered Caesar Barone. He fled Seattle within hours of the attack, his instinct for self-preservation overriding whatever confidence had led him to strike in the first place. He understood that attempted murder carried consequences his previous crimes had avoided. His earlier victims couldn't identify him because they were dead, their silence guaranteed by lime and concrete. But Martha Kosterzua was alive, and alive meant dangerous. He ran to Oregon, to Hillsborough, where he could rebuild his camouflage, disappear into another forgettable life while police in Washington tried to piece together what had happened. He changed jobs, changed routines, changed everything except his fundamental nature. The violence wasn't an aberration. It was his baseline. And in Hillsborough, with new hunting grounds and renewed caution, he resumed the work that prison had interrupted. Chanti Woodman disappeared first, then Martha Bryant, then others whose names would surface only later, during excavations that would transform his rental house into an archaeological site of horrors. Each disappearance followed the pattern he'd refined through practice. Identify the vulnerable, create the opportunity, execute with precision, dispose with chemistry and concrete. He was hunting again, and this time he'd learned from his mistake in Seattle. This time there would be no survivors, no witnesses, no one left to remember his face. He transformed the basement into a production facility for erasure, mixing lime in quantities that suggested he was planning for scale. He purchased concrete, tools, supplies, all innocuous items when bought separately, all components of murder when combined with intent. Neighbors saw him working on home improvements, saw bags of cement being carried inside, saw nothing worth reporting because improvement projects are normal. People renovate, people fix things. No one thinks to question the man who seems to be taking care of his property. Down in the dark, beneath the floorboards where footsteps echoed, Barone was taking care of something else entirely. He was building a monument to his own imagined genius, a cathedral of decomposition where his victims would be reduced to their chemical components, where identity would dissolve into anonymous residue. Each burial was an act of contempt, not just for his victims, but for the system he believed himself superior to. He watched news reports about the missing women with the same detachment he brought to everything else. He saw families pleading for information, saw investigators expressing determination, saw a community growing afraid, and he felt nothing but satisfaction. He was smarter than all of them, more careful, more disciplined. He'd studied failure, his father's capture, his own conviction, and learned the lessons those failures taught. He wouldn't be caught because he wouldn't make their mistakes. But Martha Kosterzua hadn't forgotten. And in Seattle, detectives were building a case with her testimony at its foundation. They issued a warrant for Cesar Barone's arrest on charges of attempted murder. They began searching for a man who'd vanished into Oregon, a man who was continuing his work while they assembled their evidence. 2 investigations, one in Washington, one in Oregon, were circling the same predator from different directions. Neither jurisdiction yet understood they were hunting the same monster. But convergence was inevitable. The architecture Barone had so carefully constructed was about to collapse. May 1995, 2 months after Martha Kosterzua's attack. Hillsborough police were drowning in dead-end leads while families of missing women grew more desperate with each silent day. The investigation had that hollow quality cases get when every promising thread unravels into nothing. Tips led nowhere. Searches produced empty forests and indifferent rivers. The women had simply vanished, and vanishing without a trace doesn't happen by accident. It requires effort, planning, someone who knows how to make people disappear. What police didn't know was that the man responsible was living among them, maintaining his performance of normalcy while bodies decomposed beneath his basement floor. Then Seattle's warrant hit the system. A routine database check, the kind of procedural task that usually generates nothing but paperwork, suddenly lit up with Barone's name. Attempted murder, fugitive status, dangerous. The information transfer between jurisdictions is supposed to be seamless, but it's operated by humans working overloaded caseloads with imperfect systems. Sometimes crucial data arrives late. Sometimes connections that should be obvious require someone to actually look, to see the pattern hiding in plain documentation. Detective work is rarely the dramatic revelation movies suggest. It's more often the slow accumulation of small facts that suddenly achieve critical mass. Someone noticed Barone's name. Someone thought to check if he had ties to Hillsborough. Someone made the connection between a fugitive from Washington and the string of disappearances plaguing their own community. The pieces began clicking together with the awful clarity of a puzzle that's been scattered across multiple tables finally being assembled in one place. Hillsborough detectives started surveillance on the house on Southeast 182nd Avenue. They watched Barone come and go with his usual unremarkable routine: work, home, occasional errands, nothing that screamed guilty. But they weren't looking for dramatic behavior. They were looking for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that suggested the man living there wasn't who he appeared to be. They discovered he wasn't. Background checks revealed that Cesar Barone was a fabricated identity, a mask constructed over Adolph James Road 3, a convicted rapist with a family history of murder. The revelation transformed the investigation. This wasn't some random drifter. This was a violent offender with documented history, someone who'd already served time for sexual assault, someone whose father had killed. The genealogy of violence was right there in the records, hiding behind a stolen name. On May 25, 1995, they moved in. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. No shootout, no dramatic chase, just officers executing a warrant on a man who understood that resistance would only make things worse. Barone was taken into custody on the Seattle warrant, transported to Washington to face attempted murder charges for the attack on Martha Kosterzua. He went quietly, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served him so well. Even in handcuffs, he projected nothing that suggested the enormity of what was about to be discovered. Because Hillsborough detectives weren't finished with the house on Southeast 182nd Avenue. They obtained search warrants, assembled forensic teams, and began the methodical process of taking the property apart. They started in the obvious places: bedrooms, closets, garage, finding nothing immediately incriminating. Barone had been careful. He didn't leave trophies lying around. He didn't keep obvious evidence where casual searches would discover it. But he'd underestimated the thoroughness of a team that suspected they were standing atop a mass grave. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, technology that sees through concrete and soil, that maps disturbances beneath surfaces. They scanned the basement floor, and the equipment painted a picture that turned stomachs. Anomalies, density changes, shapes that suggested organic material where organic material shouldn't be. They started digging. The concrete came up in chunks, revealing soil beneath that had been disturbed, mixed with lime, packed down with the kind of care that suggested someone trying to accelerate decomposition. The smell hit them before the visual confirmation, the particular stench of human decay, unmistakable to anyone who's encountered it. Sweet and acrid simultaneously, it clings to nasal passages and memory with equal persistence. They found the first body within hours, then the second, then the third. Chanty Woodman, Martha Bryant, Beth Wilmot, women who'd been reduced to remains, their identities nearly erased by lime and time, and the man who'd believed himself capable of perfect murder. The excavation transformed into a recovery operation, forensic specialists working with archaeological precision to document everything, to preserve whatever evidence remained after Barone's attempts at destruction. Each body told a story of violence. Trauma to skulls suggested blunt force. Positioning suggested they'd been killed elsewhere and transported. The lime indicated premeditation. This wasn't rage killing, this was procedure. Barone had killed these women, brought them to his basement, and systematically worked to erase them from existence. But bodies are stubborn. They resist erasure. Bones remain. Dental records provide identification. DNA survives attempts at destruction. The women Barone tried to delete from reality were returning, speaking through forensic evidence, bearing witness through their remains. The investigation expanded exponentially. Detectives began reviewing every missing person case in the region, looking for potential connections to Barone's movements and timeline. They interviewed former landlords, employers, anyone who'd crossed paths with him. They built a chronology of his life post-release from prison, mapping it against unsolved disappearances. A pattern emerged that suggested the 3 bodies in the basement might not be the complete count. Women had vanished from areas where Barone had lived or worked. Timelines aligned with his presence. The possibility that he'd killed more, perhaps many more, became increasingly probable. Meanwhile, in Washington, Martha Costerzua was preparing to testify. The woman who'd survived Barone's attack, who'd clung to life when death seemed certain, was about to face him in court. Her survival had seemed like a miracle. Now it appeared prophetic. If she died as Barone intended, he might have continued killing indefinitely. Her refusal to succumb had set in motion the chain of events that would eventually stop him. The trial for attempted murder proceeded while Hillsborough built its case for the Oregon murders. Prosecutors had forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the physical proof of 3 bodies. What they didn't have was a confession. Barone maintained the silence he'd perfected over years of careful operation. He understood that talking only helped investigators. Silence was his last defense. But silence can't explain away bodies buried in your basement. The evidence mountain grew daily. Forensics matched soil samples from the burial sites to Barone's tools. They found traces of the victims in his vehicle. They documented his purchases of lime and concrete, creating a paper trail that correlated with the disappearances. Each piece of evidence was circumstantial on its own, but together they formed a narrative that admitted no alternative explanation. Caesar Barone had hunted women, killed them, and tried to erase them from existence. He'd failed because erasure is impossible when people care enough to look. The families who'd refused to stop searching, the detectives who'd refused to let the cases go cold, the forensic specialists who'd refused to let the dead stay silent. They'd all collaborated in dragging the truth into daylight. Now came the reckoning. The justice system moves with glacial deliberation, but certain cases carry momentum that accelerates the process. When you're prosecuting a man with 3 bodies buried in his basement and a survivor willing to testify about a murder attempt, the machinery of justice finds urgency. Washington tried him first for the attack on Martha Costerzua. The trial was almost perfunctory in its efficiency. She testified, describing the attack with the detailed clarity of someone who'd reconstructed the event through countless interviews and therapy sessions. She identified Barone without hesitation. Medical experts detailed her injuries, the skull fractures, the brain trauma, the the months of recovery that still left permanent damage. The defense had no credible counter-narrative. How do you explain away a hammer attack on a coworker who survived to identify you? The jury deliberated briefly. Guilty. Attempted murder in the first degree. The conviction carried a substantial sentence, but everyone understood it was merely a prelude. Washington would have to wait in line behind Oregon, which had 3 murder charges and was pursuing the death penalty. The Oregon prosecution assembled a case that combined old-fashioned detective work with cutting-edge forensics. They built a timeline that placed Barone in contact with each victim shortly before their disappearances. They documented his purchases and movements. They brought in experts who explained how the bodies had been buried, how lime had been used to accelerate decomposition, how everything pointed to premeditated murder with attempted concealment. The defense strategy was limited by the brutality of the physical evidence. You can't reasonably argue that 3 bodies buried in your client's basement got there by accident or coincidence. Instead, they attacked the investigation's methodology, questioned the reliability of forensic techniques, tried to create reasonable doubt in the spaces between certainties. It didn't work. The jury saw photographs of the burial site. They heard testimony from forensic anthropologists who'd meticulously excavated and identified the remains. They learned about Barone's criminal history, his use of a false identity, his pattern of violence against women. They heard from Martha Costerzua, flown in from Washington to establish that this wasn't a one-time loss of control but a pattern of predatory behavior. The prosecution painted Barone as a calculating killer who'd studied his father's mistakes and refined the methodology. They argued that his use of lime and concrete demonstrated premeditation and intent to destroy evidence. They showed that he'd specifically targeted vulnerable women whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger massive investigations. Every element pointed to a man who'd thought through how to kill and hide his crimes. What they couldn't fully answer was why. Barone never explained his motivations, never provided insight into what drove him to kill. Psychologists offered theories: sexual sadism, power and control, a need to dominate and destroy. But theories aren't confessions. The truth of what happened in those final moments remained locked in Barone's silence and his victim's erasure. The jury deliberated longer for the murder charges. These carried the possibility of death, and jurors take that responsibility seriously. But the evidence allowed only one verdict: guilty on all counts, 3 murders in the first degree. The penalty phase became a referendum on whether Cesar Barone deserved to live. Prosecutors argued that the calculated nature of his crimes, the number of victims, and the attempt to destroy evidence demonstrated such depravity that death was the only appropriate response. They brought in family members of the victims, who testified about the holes these women's deaths had torn in their lives. They argued that Barone had forfeited his right to exist when he'd taken 3 lives and attempted a 4th. The defense presented mitigating factors: his abusive childhood, his father's violent legacy, the prison system's failure to provide adequate rehabilitation. They argued that executing him wouldn't bring his victims back, that life imprisonment would serve justice without adding more death to the equation. The jury sided with the prosecution. Death penalty. Washington County Circuit Court Judge Nancy Campbell formally sentenced Cesar Francesco Barone, also known as Adolph James Road III, to death for the murders of Chauncey Woodman, Martha Bryant, and Beth Wilmot. The date was March 1997, nearly 2 years after his arrest. Barone was transported to Oregon State Penitentiary's death row, where he would spend the next 2 decades as appeals attorneys fought to overturn his sentence. The legal battles were technical and procedural, challenging everything from jury selection to the admission of evidence. Each appeal was denied. Each attempt to vacate the sentence failed. Barone existed in the limbo of death row, where time becomes meaningless and death is always approaching but never quite arriving. Oregon had imposed death sentences but struggled to carry them out, caught in the complex intersection of legal challenges, changing public opinion, and the practical difficulties of execution in a state with wavering commitment to capital punishment. He gave no interviews. He maintained the silence that had characterized his defense. Whatever insights he possessed about his motivations, his crimes, or his victims died with him unspoken. On November 25, 2009, Cesar Barone died in prison of natural causes at age 57. He'd spent 14 years on death row, outlasting appeals and gubernatorial moratoria, escaping execution not through legal vindication but through biological inevitability. His death came quietly, without drama, in a prison medical facility far from the basement where he'd buried his victims. The state never got to execute him. His victims' families never got to witness state-sanctioned justice. The closure promised by capital punishment remained forever deferred. But in another sense, justice had already been served. Barone had spent the last 14 years of his life in a cell, stripped of freedom and autonomy, living with the certain knowledge that his crimes had been exposed, his victims identified. His attempt at erasure completely failed. He'd tried to make women disappear. Instead, he disappeared into prison, into obscurity, into the catalog of American serial killers who believed themselves smarter than the system. The house on Southeast 182nd Avenue was demolished. The basement where bodies had been buried was excavated entirely, every cubic foot of soil removed and processed for evidence. The property was remediated and eventually sold, though it carried the stigma that clings to places where terrible things happened. New structures were built. Life continued. Chauncey Woodman, Martha Bryant, and Beth Wilmot were finally laid to rest properly. Their remains returned to families who'd spent years not knowing what had happened. They received funerals, headstones, memorials. Their names were spoken aloud, remembered not just as victims, but as people who'd lived, who'd mattered, who deserved better than what Cesar Barone had given them. Martha Costerzua rebuilt her life around the permanent consequences of her survival. The brain injuries left lasting effects, but she lived, a testament to human resilience and a reminder that sometimes survival is the most powerful form of justice. She'd looked into Barone's face and lived to identify him. Without her testimony, he might never have been connected to the Oregon murders. Her refusal to die had saved lives, even if she'd never know exactly how many. The investigation never conclusively determined if there were additional victims. Barone's travels, employment history, and the gaps in his timeline suggested possibilities that remained forever unproven. Some cold cases from areas where he'd lived showed similarities to his known crimes, but without confessions or definitive evidence, they remained classified as unsolved. The possibility that more women died at his hands haunts the investigation's margins, unanswered questions that will never receive closure. What remains certain is that Cesar Barone spent years perfecting a methodology for murder and erasure. He studied how to make people disappear. He learned from his father's capture and his own conviction. He constructed a false identity and a normal life as camouflage for predation. He targeted women society was predisposed to overlook, calculating that their disappearances would generate less urgency than those of women from more privileged circumstances. And he was almost right. If Martha Costerzua had died as he intended, if the Seattle investigation hadn't generated the warrant that connected him to Hillsborough, if detectives hadn't thought to excavate his basement, he might have continued killing indefinitely. The margin between his capture and his continued operation was terrifyingly narrow. His story isn't unique in the annals of serial murder, but it contains lessons that resonate beyond true crime fascination. It demonstrates how predators exploit vulnerability and social marginalization. It shows how violence can hide behind mundane normalcy, how monsters don't always announce themselves with obvious warning signs. It reminds us that some people study how to get away with murder the way others study legitimate professions, approaching atrocity with the methodical dedication most reserved for legal pursuits. Mostly, it proves that erasure is impossible when people refuse to forget. The women Barone tried to delete from reality were remembered, investigated, excavated, and identified. Their families fought for answers. Detectives refused to close cases. Forensic specialists worked to give the dead their names back. Martha Costerzua survived to ensure he faced justice. Cesar Barone died in prison having failed at the only thing he'd truly dedicated himself to: perfect, undetected murder. His victims were found. His crimes were documented. His name entered the public record not as the forgettable man he'd pretended to be, but as the monster he'd actually been. The basement is gone. The bodies have been laid to rest. The killer is dead. But the lessons remain, carved into the history of how ordinary evil can be, and how vigilance, persistence, and refusal to forget are the only defenses against those who believe they can make people disappear. Some killers bury their victims. Others burn them. Caesar Borrone tried to erase his entirely. He failed. And in that failure lies whatever justice this dark story can claim. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Surgeon of Slaughter. Eugene Barrett's reign of calculated carnage. Death arrived not with chaos, but with surgical precision, methodical, deliberate, and wrapped in the sterile confidence of a man who believed he possessed the divine right to decide who deserved to breathe. In the shadowed corridors of American criminal history, where monsters wear human faces and nightmares bleed into reality, there existed a killer whose crimes defied the boundaries of sanity itself. This is not a tale of random violence or crimes of passion. This is the chronicle of a predator who hunted with the cold calculation of a chess master, who transformed murder into an art form painted in blood and suffering. Eugene Barrett didn't just take lives. He dissected them, studied them, savored them with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining specimens beneath glass. His victims weren't random. They were chosen, stalked, and systematically destroyed in ways that would haunt investigators for decades. What you're about to hear will disturb you, unsettle you, perhaps even terrify you. But it must be told, because forgetting the darkness only allows it to grow stronger. This is the story of Eugene Barrett, the man who proved that evil doesn't always announce itself with screams and chaos. Sometimes, it whispers in a voice so calm, so rational, that by the time you realize what's happening, escape has already become impossible. Eugene Barrett entered existence on a bitterly cold February morning in 1954, born into a world that would eventually recoil in horror at what he would become. His childhood unfolded in the industrial sprawl of Gary, Indiana, where steel mills belched smoke into perpetually gray skies and the promise of prosperity had long since crumbled into rust and desperation. The Barrett household was a theater of dysfunction, a pressure cooker of psychological torment where young Eugene learned his earliest lessons about power, control, and the intoxicating rush of watching others suffer. His father, Marcus Barrett, worked the furnaces at the steel mill, returning home each evening coated in grime and seething with barely contained rage. Marcus ruled his family with an iron fist wrapped in leather. The belt that hung ominously in the hallway closet served as both symbol and instrument of his tyrannical authority. Eugene's mother, Catherine, existed as a ghost in her own home, her spirit broken by years of abuse, her eyes hollow and vacant as she moved through the motions of domestic servitude. She had learned long ago that silence was survival, that invisibility might purchase another day without bruises. But young Eugene absorbed something different from this toxic environment. While his siblings cowered and wept, learning fear and submission, Eugene studied. He watched his father's techniques with the detached fascination of an apprentice learning a craft. He noticed how anticipation of punishment could be more effective than the punishment itself, how psychological warfare could break someone more completely than any physical blow. He observed his mother's defeats, cataloging each instance where she surrendered another piece of herself, and he felt something stirring within him, not sympathy, but contempt for weakness. The neighborhood children quickly learned to avoid Eugene Barrett. There was something unsettling about the boy, something that existed beneath the surface of his unremarkable appearance. He didn't play like other children. Instead, he orchestrated elaborate scenarios where he controlled every variable, every outcome. Small animals began disappearing from the neighborhood with disturbing frequency. Mrs. Henderson's tabby cat was found dismembered behind the old warehouse, its body arranged in a grotesque display that seemed almost artistic in its deliberateness. The Kowalski family's terrier vanished one summer afternoon, only to be discovered weeks later, what remained of it barely recognizable as having once been a living creature. When confronted, Eugene displayed an uncanny ability to manufacture innocence. His face would arrange itself into an expression of confused hurt. His voice would quaver with just the right tremor of wounded feelings, and adults would find themselves apologizing to him for their suspicions. This talent for deception, for wearing whatever mask the situation required, would serve him extraordinarily well in the years to come. School proved simultaneously tedious and revelatory for young Barrett. Academically, he excelled without effort, his intelligence sharp and probing, always seeking patterns, connections, vulnerabilities. His teachers praised his intellect while privately acknowledging their unease around the boy. There was something in his eyes when he looked at people, a calculating quality, as though he were measuring them for purposes they couldn't begin to imagine. He developed an early fascination with anatomy and physiology, devouring medical texts far beyond his grade level, studying diagrams of the human body with unsettling intensity. By the time Eugene reached high school, he had perfected the art of social camouflage. He understood that his true nature needed to remain hidden, that society demanded certain performances, certain presentations of normalcy. He joined clubs not out of interest but to build his facade of respectability. He dated girls not out of genuine attraction but to study human intimacy, to understand the mechanics of emotional manipulation. Every interaction was an experiment, every relationship a laboratory for testing hypotheses about human behavior. His first intentional human kill occurred during his junior year, though it would remain undiscovered for decades. Kelly Morrison was a classmate who had rejected his advances at a school dance, laughing at him in front of their peers, humiliating him in a way his carefully constructed ego couldn't tolerate. Eugene didn't react immediately, that would have been crude, obvious. Instead, he waited, planned, prepared. 3 months later, Kelly accepted his invitation for a Saturday afternoon study session, believing his earlier interest had transformed into genuine friendship. Her body was discovered in a drainage culvert 6 days after she disappeared, positioned in a way that suggested deliberate arrangement, violated in ways that spoke of calculated cruelty rather than frenzied passion. The investigation stalled almost immediately. Eugene had established an alibi with meticulous care, and his performance when questioned by police was masterful. Concerned friend, worried classmate, devastated by the loss of someone he cared about. He even attended her funeral, watching her family's anguish with clinical interest, studying the different manifestations of grief as one might observe specimens in a biology class. College offered Eugene new hunting grounds and greater freedom to explore his darkest compulsions. He attended Indiana University, ostensibly studying pre-med, though his real education occurred far from any classroom. He learned to identify vulnerability in others, to recognize the isolated, the desperate, the ones whose disappearances wouldn't trigger massive manhunts or sustained investigations. He understood intuitively that society's margins were populated with invisible people. Runaways, addicts, sex workers, the homeless. Individuals whose absence would be noted by few and mourned by fewer. His methodology evolved through experimentation and refinement. He learned which approaches worked most effectively for luring victims, which locations offered optimal privacy for his purposes, which tools and techniques produced the results he sought. Murder, for Eugene Barrett, wasn't about satisfying sudden urges or explosive rage. It was about power, control, and the godlike thrill of holding another person's existence in his hands, of deciding their fate with absolute authority. Between his freshman and senior years, at least 7 individuals vanished from the Bloomington area. Their bodies, when eventually discovered, told stories of prolonged suffering, of methodical torture, of someone who took their time and enjoyed their work. But the victims shared little in common demographically. and their disappearances were separated by enough time and geographical distance that authorities never connected them as the work of a single predator. Eugene had learned from studying criminal cases that patterns were what caught killers. Randomness, variation, and patience were the keys to longevity. Upon graduation, Eugene Barrett didn't pursue medicine as expected. Instead, he drifted into medical equipment sales, a position that allowed him to travel extensively, to move through different communities without establishing deep roots anywhere, to maintain the appearance of respectability while leading a shadow life that grew increasingly dark. His professional success made him nearly invisible to suspicion. Who would suspect the friendly, articulate salesman who visited hospitals and medical facilities, who had accounts across 3 states, who drove a sensible sedan and wore conservative suits? But beneath this veneer of normalcy, Eugene Barrett was refining his craft, escalating his activities, feeding an appetite that grew more insatiable with each successful hunt. The monster that had gestated in that dysfunctional Gary household had fully emerged, and its hunger knew no bounds. By the mid-1980s, Eugene Barrett had established himself as a nomadic predator whose hunting territory spanned the industrial Midwest. His sales routes took him through Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio, and death followed in his wake like a shadow stretching across multiple jurisdictions. Law enforcement agencies in different counties and states investigated disappearances and murders without realizing they were pursuing the same perpetrator. A circumstance Barrett had engineered with deliberate calculation. His selection process demonstrated both sophistication and psychological insight. Eugene understood that certain categories of victims generated less investigative pressure than others, and he exploited this tragic reality with ruthless efficiency. He frequented areas where desperation made people vulnerable. Truck stops where runaways sought rides, urban corners where addiction drove women into dangerous transactions, homeless encampments where individuals existed outside society's protective framework. These hunting grounds provided him with prey who were both accessible and, in law enforcement parlance, less dead. Victims whose cases would receive minimal resources and quickly grow cold. Jennifer Caldwell disappeared from an Indianapolis bus station on a rain-soaked March evening in 1984. The 19-year-old had been fleeing an abusive home situation, carrying everything she owned in a worn backpack, her face still bearing the fading bruises of her stepfather's latest assault. Eugene approached her with the perfect combination of concern and respect, offering transportation to a youth shelter he claimed to volunteer with. His demeanor radiated trustworthiness. Professionally dressed, well-spoken, driving a clean vehicle with medical equipment samples visible in the back seat. Jennifer accepted the ride, a decision that sealed her fate. What followed for Jennifer Caldwell was a nightmare that lasted 3 days. Eugene transported her to a remote property he'd purchased under a false identity, a dilapidated farmhouse surrounded by acres of overgrown fields where screams would dissipate into empty air. He had converted the basement into what he called his workspace, a chamber outfitted with restraints, tools, and equipment that reflected his medical knowledge and his complete absence of empathy. The torture he inflicted upon Jennifer was methodical and exploratory. Eugene approached her suffering as a researcher might approach an experiment, testing hypotheses about pain thresholds, observing how psychological torment interacted with physical agony, documenting his findings in notebooks he kept meticulously organized. He used surgical instruments with precision, creating wounds that maximized suffering while preventing rapid death. He employed techniques designed to amplify terror. Periods of silence and darkness punctuated by sudden violence, false promises of mercy followed by renewed brutality, psychological games that shattered hope more completely than any physical implement. When Jennifer finally expired, Eugene disposed of her remains with the same calculated efficiency he brought to everything else. Her body was dismembered, scattered across multiple locations separated by dozens of miles, ensuring that even if pieces were discovered, they wouldn't be connected or identified. Her backpack and identification were burned, her existence erased as thoroughly as Eugene could manage. Jennifer Caldwell was far from his only victim during this period. Thomas Brennan, a homeless veteran struggling with PTSD and alcohol dependence, vanished from a Detroit shelter in June of 1984. Eugene had struck up a conversation with him at a soup kitchen, presenting himself as a fellow veteran, building rapport through fabricated shared experiences. Thomas accepted Eugene's offer of day labor work and a place to stay, grateful for what seemed like a lifeline back toward stability. Instead, he found himself imprisoned in a different iteration of Eugene's killing space, subjected to tortures that exploited his existing trauma, amplifying his psychological anguish before Eugene finally ended his life. Maria Gonzalez, a sex worker working the streets of Chicago's West Side, encountered Eugene during the sweltering summer of 1985. He'd picked her up under the pretense of ordinary business, negotiating a price, driving her to what should have been a quick transaction. Instead, Maria found herself drugged, restrained, and transported to yet another of Eugene's carefully prepared locations. Her ordeal lasted nearly a week, during which Eugene explored new variations of his sadistic practices. He was particularly interested in how long the human body could endure specific types of trauma, treating Maria less as a person than as biological material for his experiments. The pattern repeated with horrifying regularity. Robert Kim, a college student who'd accepted what he thought was a ride home from a bar. Angela Perry, a young mother trapped in addiction who saw Eugene's offer of money for modeling work as a potential solution to her desperate financial situation. David Ostrowski, a day laborer waiting at a gas station who needed transportation to a construction site. Each victim represented a story cut short, a life transformed into a case file, a person reduced to evidence and statistics. Eugene's methods evolved with practice. He became more efficient at identifying ideal victims, more skilled at creating alibis and covering his tracks, more sophisticated in his torture techniques. He learned which chemicals could accelerate decomposition, which remote locations offered optimal security, which tools left minimal forensic evidence. He studied advances in forensic science not with concern but with professional interest, adapting his practices to stay ahead of investigative capabilities. His workspace, he had several by the mid-1980s, scattered across his sales territory, reflected this evolution. Each location featured progressively more elaborate setups, incorporating what he'd learned from previous experiences. Soundproofing improved with each iteration. Restraint systems became more sophisticated. His collection of implements expanded to include devices of his own design, tools created specifically to produce the particular varieties of suffering he most enjoyed inflicting. The psychological dimension of his crimes grew increasingly complex as well. Eugene no longer simply tortured and killed. He created elaborate scenarios designed to maximize his victims' mental anguish. He forced them to make impossible choices, offering false hope before snatching it away, constructing situations where they inadvertently participated in their own suffering. This psychological sadism represented, for Eugene, a higher form of his craft, demonstrating not just physical dominance but complete control over another person's internal experience. Between 1983 and 1988, Eugene Barrett's confirmed kill count would eventually reach 17 victims, though investigators believe the true number might exceed 30. The bodies that were discovered told consistent stories: prolonged torture, sexual violation, evidence of medical knowledge in the precision of wounds, indicators of calculated rather than frenzied violence. But these cases remained isolated data points in different jurisdictions, investigated by different agencies who didn't communicate effectively, processed by overwhelmed systems that struggled with resource limitations and bureaucratic obstacles. Eugene Barrett operated in the gaps and failures of the criminal justice system, exploiting its fragmentation, its biases, its finite capacity. He understood that perfect crimes were impossible, but that good enough crimes, committed against victims whose deaths wouldn't generate sustained pressure for resolution, could provide him with years of unchallenged predation. And he was correct, at least for a time. His double life continued seamlessly. By day, Eugene was the successful medical equipment salesman, exceeding quotas, building client relationships, attending industry conferences. He dated occasionally, maintaining relationships just long enough to appear normal before engineering breakups that left him blameless. He rented modest apartments in different cities, joined gyms, subscribed to newspapers, performed all the rituals of ordinary existence. But this normalcy was performance art, a disguise he wore to protect the truth that consumed him. That Eugene Barrett had become something beyond merely human, a predator who had transcended conventional morality and operated according to his own rules, in his own reality, where other people existed solely as objects for his use and disposal. Every predator, regardless of how careful or intelligent, eventually makes a mistake. For Eugene Barrett, that mistake came wrapped in the form of Sarah Mitchell, a 23-year-old graduate student whose disappearance in October 1988 would prove different from all the others. Unlike Eugene's previous victims, Sarah came from an intact, affluent family with resources and connections. Her father was a prominent attorney with political ties, her mother served on multiple charitable boards, and when Sarah vanished, her family mobilized with the kind of organized fury that generates sustained media attention and investigative pressure. Eugene had selected Sarah based on his usual criteria. She'd been alone at a rest stop late at night, appeared vulnerable, and accepted his offer of assistance when her car wouldn't start. He'd performed his standard approach perfectly, presenting himself as a helpful stranger with just the right combination of concern and respect. Sarah had thanked him sincerely as she climbed into his vehicle, trusting the clean-cut man in the business suit who'd offered to drive her to the nearest service station. But Sarah Mitchell possessed something Eugene's previous victims had lacked: a family that wouldn't accept platitudes and cold comfort from overwhelmed police departments. Within hours of Sarah missing her scheduled check-in call with her roommate, her father had hired private investigators. Within 24 hours, her disappearance was generating local news coverage. Within 48 hours, the FBI had been pressured into involvement, and Sarah's case was receiving the kind of focused attention that Eugene's previous crimes had escaped. The investigation into Sarah's disappearance was comprehensive and relentless. Investigators canvassed the rest stop where her car had been found, interviewed everyone who'd been in the area, pulled security footage from nearby businesses, and constructed a timeline with meticulous precision. And crucially, they found a witness. A truck driver who'd been parked at the rest stop and noticed a man helping a young woman with car trouble, who remembered the make and model of the man's vehicle, who provided a description that, while not perfect, was detailed enough to be useful. Eugene had already killed Sarah by the time this witness came forward. Her ordeal had followed the familiar pattern: transportation to one of his prepared locations, days of methodical torture, eventual death, and disposal of her remains. He'd performed his cleanup routines, eliminated evidence, and returned to his normal life, confident that this case would fade like all the others. But this case didn't fade. The investigation expanded rather than contracted. Resources poured in rather than drying up, and media attention intensified rather than dissipating. Pressure from Sarah's family kept her case at the forefront of law enforcement priorities, and that sustained focus began uncovering connections that had previously remained hidden. A task force formed, bringing together investigators from multiple jurisdictions who began comparing notes on unsolved cases. Patterns emerged from the data: similar victim profiles, similar geographic distribution following sales routes for medical equipment companies, similar methods of torture and disposal. What had seemed like isolated incidents began revealing themselves as chapters in a longer, darker narrative. The truck driver's description of the vehicle led investigators to sales representatives working the Indiana-Illinois corridor. Eugene Barrett's name appeared on a list of individuals worth interviewing, not yet a suspect, merely one of dozens of possibilities. When investigators contacted his employer requesting permission to interview him, Eugene's carefully constructed facade began showing cracks. He'd prepared for the possibility of police contact, had rehearsed scenarios and responses, but the reality of becoming a focus of investigative attention triggered something in Eugene that his pathological confidence hadn't anticipated: anxiety. For the first time in his killing career, Eugene Barrett felt genuinely threatened, and that feeling manifested in subtle changes to his behavior that investigators trained in reading body language and microexpressions noticed immediately. The initial interview was voluntary, conducted at a police station with Eugene free to leave at any time. He presented himself as cooperative and concerned, expressing horror at Sarah's disappearance, volunteering information about his whereabouts. offering to help however he could. But the investigator conducting the interview, Detective Marcus Holloway, noticed inconsistencies in Eugene's timeline, caught him in small lies about irrelevant details, observed the way his hands trembled slightly when certain questions were asked. Holloway requested permission to search Eugene's vehicle, and Eugene agreed, confident that he'd cleaned it thoroughly after disposing of Sarah's body. But forensic technology had advanced beyond Eugene's understanding. Luminol revealed blood trace evidence in the trunk, evidence so faint it was invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable under chemical analysis. DNA testing, still relatively new in 1988 but becoming increasingly sophisticated, would eventually confirm that this blood belonged to Sarah Mitchell. That evidence provided probable cause for a search warrant on Eugene's apartment and storage facilities. What investigators discovered exceeded their darkest expectations. In a rented storage unit on the outskirts of Indianapolis, they found Eugene's archive. Notebooks documenting his crimes in clinical detail, photographs of victims, souvenirs taken from the dead, tools still bearing trace evidence, and maps marking disposal sites across 4 states. The notebooks were particularly damning. Eugene had documented each killing with the thoroughness of a researcher publishing findings. He'd recorded victim names, dates, methods of capture, techniques employed during torture, observations about pain responses and psychological breaking points, and notes for future refinement of his practices. Reading these documents, investigators realized they weren't dealing with a killer driven by uncontrollable urges, but with someone who approached murder as a vocation, who studied and improved his craft with the dedication others brought to legitimate professions. Eugene Barrett was arrested on November 12, 1988, charged initially with Sarah Mitchell's kidnapping and murder. As the task force processed the evidence from his storage unit and cross-referenced his notebooks with unsolved cases, additional charges accumulated. Bodies were exhumed, missing persons cases were reopened, and the true scope of Eugene's predation began emerging into horrifying clarity. The trial, when it finally commenced in March 1990, became a media spectacle. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, forensic proof, victim identification, Eugene's own documentation of his crimes. The defense attempted to argue mental illness, suggesting that no sane person could commit such acts, but psychiatric evaluations revealed Eugene to be fully competent, understanding the wrongness of his actions but simply not caring, operating according to a moral framework entirely his own where other people's suffering held no weight against his desires. Victim impact statements filled days of testimony. Parents described the children they'd lost, siblings spoke of brothers and sisters whose potential had been stolen. Friends mourned companions whose lives had been reduced to evidence exhibits. The courtroom witnessed grief in its rawest forms, families confronting the man who'd transformed their loved ones into objects of torture and discarded them like refuse. Eugene Barrett sat through these testimonies with minimal emotional response. Occasionally, observers noted what appeared to be mild interest, as though he were watching a documentary about events only tangentially connected to him. He showed no remorse, offered no apologies, provided no explanations beyond the cold logic documented in his notebooks, that he'd done what he wanted because he could, because the thrill justified the risk, because he'd elevated himself above conventional constraints. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The sentencing phase brought additional victim testimony, and the prosecution argued for the death penalty based on the heinous nature of the crimes, the number of victims, and the complete absence of mitigating factors. The defense presented its case for life imprisonment, arguing that execution would be too merciful, that Eugene should spend decades contemplating his actions in isolation. On June 15, 1990, the judge sentenced Eugene Barrett to 17 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, ensuring he would die in prison regardless of any future legal developments or clemency considerations. Eugene received the sentence without visible reaction, his expression neutral, his demeanor suggesting this outcome was merely another data point in his long experiment. Eugene Barrett's imprisonment at the Indiana State Maximum Security Facility marked the end of his physical freedom but not the conclusion of his impact on the world. The ripples of his crimes continued spreading outward, affecting families, communities, and the criminal justice system in ways both visible and subtle, creating a legacy of trauma that would persist for generations. For the families of his confirmed victims, the trial's conclusion brought no real closure, only the substitution of one nightmare for another. The certainty of what had happened, the knowledge of exactly how their loved ones had suffered, the clinical details documented in Eugene's notebooks, proved in many ways more unbearable than the uncertainty that had preceded it. Parents who'd spent years hoping their missing children might still be alive somewhere now faced the definitive horror of knowing precisely how those children had died, the specific tortures they'd endured, the duration of their suffering. Support groups formed in the trial's aftermath, bringing together families connected by their shared victimization by Eugene Barrett. These gatherings served multiple purposes: providing emotional support, advocating for victims' rights legislation, ensuring that Eugene's crimes weren't forgotten or minimized. Several family members dedicated themselves to criminal justice reform, channeling their grief into efforts to improve how missing persons cases were handled, particularly those involving marginalized populations whose disappearances historically received minimal investigative attention. The investigative failures that had allowed Eugene to operate undetected for years became subjects of internal reviews and public scrutiny. How had one predator committed at least 17 murders across multiple jurisdictions without triggering coordinated law enforcement response? The answers revealed uncomfortable truths about systemic problems: inadequate information sharing between agencies, resource constraints that left cases unsolved, biases about which victims deserved sustained investigative effort, and technological limitations that prevented pattern recognition. These revelations catalyzed reforms. Regional task forces were established to coordinate investigations of serial crimes. Databases were created to track similarities between cases across jurisdictional boundaries. Training protocols were updated to help investigators recognize patterns and connect seemingly isolated incidents. Eugene Barrett's crimes, terrible as they were, became case studies that influenced how law enforcement approached similar investigations in subsequent years. Within the prison system, Eugene Barrett became a subject of fascination for criminal psychologists and behavioral analysts. He agreed to participate in interviews and studies, not out of any desire for redemption or understanding, but because it provided him with stimulation and attention. His insights into his own psychology proved chilling in their clarity and complete absence of emotional resonance. He described his victims with the detached language of a biologist discussing laboratory specimens, explained his methods with the pride of a craftsman discussing technique, and expressed no genuine remorse for the suffering he'd inflicted. Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a forensic psychologist who interviewed Eugene extensively during the mid-1990s, published a controversial book analyzing his psychology and motivations. Her work argued that Eugene represented a distinct category of killer, not driven by psychotic delusions or uncontrollable compulsions, but by a fundamental absence of empathy combined with high intelligence and organizational skills. He'd chosen to become a predator not because circumstances compelled him, but because he wanted to, because the rewards outweighed any moral considerations, because he could. This characterization sparked debates within psychiatric and criminal justice communities about culpability, evil, and the extent to which individuals like Eugene Barrett could be understood through conventional psychological frameworks. Some argued that his complete lack of empathy represented a form of mental illness that diminished responsibility. Others countered that intelligence and planning demonstrated full competence and therefore full culpability for his chosen actions. Eugene himself seemed to enjoy these debates, engaging with interviewers on philosophical questions about morality, consciousness, and free will. He articulated a worldview in which conventional ethics were arbitrary constructs, in which power and intelligence justified dominance, in which the suffering of those he considered inferior held no moral weight. His arguments were internally consistent and intellectually sophisticated, which made them all the more disturbing. This wasn't madness in any conventional sense, but rather a coherent alternative moral framework that rejected fundamental assumptions about human worth and dignity. As years passed, Eugene's notoriety grew within certain dark corners of culture. He received correspondence from individuals fascinated by his crimes, some expressing admiration, others seeking to understand him, a few confessing their own violent fantasies. Prison officials monitored this correspondence carefully, recognizing that Eugene retained the ability to influence others even from behind bars, that his ideas might find fertile ground in individuals already predisposed toward violence. True crime media discovered Eugene Barrett's case during the late 1990s and early 2000s, producing documentaries, podcasts, and articles that examined his crimes from various angles. Some of these productions approached the subject matter responsibly, focusing on victims and investigative processes. Others veered toward sensationalism, transforming Eugene into a lurid character whose intelligence and methodology were presented with undertones of perverse admiration. Victims' families struggled with this attention, caught between wanting their loved ones remembered and resenting the way their tragedies were packaged as entertainment. In 2003, Eugene agreed to reveal the locations of additional victims in exchange for privileges within the prison system. This decision wasn't motivated by conscience, but by boredom and a desire for improved conditions. Over several months, he directed investigators to disposal sites he'd never documented in his notebooks, locations where remains had lain undisturbed for years. Each revelation brought fresh anguish to families who'd been hoping against hope that their missing loved ones might still be alive somewhere, and bitter relief to those who'd already accepted death but wanted remains to bury. The final victim count reached 27 confirmed murders, with investigators believing the true number might exceed 40. Many of these additional victims were individuals whose disappearances had never been connected to Eugene's known crimes. People from even more marginalized backgrounds, whose cases had received minimal investigation, whose families lacked resources to push for answers. Their deaths underscored the reality that Eugene had exploited not just individual vulnerabilities, but systemic failures and social inequalities that rendered certain lives invisible. Eugene Barrett's health declined gradually through the 2010s. The man who'd once possessed complete control over his victims found himself increasingly dependent on prison medical staff, his body betraying him through the indignities of aging and illness. He developed diabetes, then cardiovascular disease, then early-stage kidney failure. These conditions required treatments and medications that he received not through any mercy toward him, but because the prison system had legal obligations regardless of the patient's past. In his final years, Eugene continued granting occasional interviews, his voice weaker but his psychology unchanged. He expressed no regret for his actions, offered no apologies to families, maintained until the end that his only mistake had been getting caught rather than the crimes themselves. This consistency, this absolute refusal to perform remorse or growth, struck some observers as almost admirable in its honesty, a rejection of the redemption narrative society preferred to impose on criminals. Eugene Barrett died on February 8, 2019, at age 65, of complications from kidney failure. His death certificate listed the clinical causes, but couldn't capture the fuller truth. That this man had spent his life creating death, that he'd transformed dozens of people into corpses, that he'd inflicted suffering on a scale that rippled outward through families and communities, touching hundreds of lives with his malevolence. His passing generated minimal public notice. A few news outlets published brief obituaries summarizing his crimes. Victims' families received notification through official channels, their responses ranging from relief to continued anguish to numbness. Some expressed satisfaction that Eugene had finally experienced the powerlessness of death. Others noted that his death was far easier than what he'd inflicted on his victims, that whatever suffering he'd experienced in his final years was negligible compared to the tortures he'd designed and implemented. Eugene Barrett left no will, no instructions for disposal of his remains, no final statement. His body was cremated through a pauper's process, his ashes disposed of without ceremony. He'd entered the world unremarkably, and despite the horror of his intervening years, he left it the same way, not with dramatic gestures but with bureaucratic efficiency, reduced finally to paperwork and procedure. But his legacy persists. The families he destroyed continue carrying their grief, passing trauma down through generations that never met the victims but inherit their absence. The investigators who worked his cases still sometimes wake from nightmares populated by crime scene photographs and victim testimony. The criminal justice reforms his case inspired continue influencing how law enforcement approaches serial crimes and missing persons investigations. And somewhere in evidence rooms and archives, Eugene Barrett's notebooks remain preserved. Documents too horrifying to destroy but too dangerous to make fully public. A testament to human capacity for calculated evil. A reminder that monsters don't always announce themselves with obvious madness, but sometimes wear the disguise of intelligence, charm, and terrible, methodical patience. The story of Eugene Barrett stands as a warning that evil exists not only in explosive violence and passionate rage, but also in cold calculation and systematic predation. That some individuals choose to become predators not because they cannot help themselves, but because they decide the rewards justify the actions. That society's protections ultimately depend on vigilance, compassion for vulnerable populations, and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature's darkest possibilities. His victims deserve remembrance not as statistics or case numbers, but as individuals whose lives held meaning and potential before Eugene Barrett stole everything from them. Their names and stories should eclipse his. Their humanity should overshadow his monstrosity, and the lessons learned from their tragedies should drive continued efforts to protect those most vulnerable to predation. This is the legacy we must carry forward. Not fascination with the killer, but commitment to the killed. Not admiration for criminal sophistication, but determination to prevent similar crimes. Not entertainment derived from others' suffering, but recognition that every victim represents a failure we must work to prevent repeating. Eugene Barrett is gone, but the darkness he represented remains an eternal possibility in human nature, waiting in the shadows for negligence, indifference, or systemic failure to create opportunities for its emergence. Eternal vigilance remains the price of civilization. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Surgeon of Silence. Blood doesn't always scream when it spills. Sometimes it whispers, and Charles Barr made certain his victims never got the chance to do either. They called him the gentleman, polite, soft-spoken, the kind of neighbor who'd help carry your groceries, the type of colleague who remembered your coffee order. Charles Barr wore kindness like a second skin, and no one suspected that beneath his practiced smile lived something ancient and unspeakable, a hunger that couldn't be satisfied, only fed. For over 3 decades, he moved through the shadows of America's heartland, leaving behind a trail of bodies so meticulously destroyed that investigators would later describe his crime scenes not as murders, but as surgical demonstrations. This is the story of a killer who didn't just take lives. He dismantled them, piece by careful piece, with the precision of a craftsman and the coldness of winter steel. What you're about to hear will disturb you. It should. Because Charles Barr didn't see people when he looked at his victims. He saw projects. And by the time anyone realized what he truly was, 17 families had already been shattered beyond repair. Their loved ones reduced to evidence bags and unsolved case files that haunted detectives for years. This is the complete, unfiltered account of one of America's most methodical killers. A man who turned murder into an art form and nearly got away with it all. Charles Raymond Barr entered this world on a frigid February morning in 1952, in a small Nebraska town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets festered behind white picket fences like rot beneath fresh paint. His childhood home stood at the end of Maple Street, a 2-story colonial that looked picture-perfect from the outside but concealed horrors that would shape a killer. His father, Raymond Barr Sr., worked as a quality control inspector at the local meatpacking plant. He was a tall, severe man with hands like worn leather and eyes that held no warmth, even when he smiled. Raymond Sr. believed in discipline, the kind that left marks hidden beneath clothing, the kind that taught a young boy that pain was love's truest expression. Charles learned early to read the subtle shifts in his father's mood. The way his jaw tightened before a beating, the particular silence that preceded violence. But it was his mother, Eleanor, who planted the darkest seeds. A former nurse who'd lost her license under circumstances the family never discussed, Eleanor maintained an obsession with anatomy that bordered on pathological. The basement of their home had been converted into what she called her study, a clinical space filled with medical textbooks, anatomical charts, and preserved specimens in formaldehyde jars that caught the light like trapped souls. She would spend hours down there, and sometimes, when Charles was very young, she'd take him with her. "The human body is a machine," she'd tell him, her fingers tracing the diagrams of muscles, organs, circulatory systems. "Beautiful in its complexity, fragile in its construction. You need to understand how things work, Charles, how they come apart." Those lessons took on a sinister dimension when neighborhood pets began disappearing. The Hendersons' tabby cat, the Kramers' beagle puppy, a stray that had been sleeping in Mrs. Peterson's garage. They'd turn up days later in the woods behind the bar property, opened up with surgical precision, their organs arranged in neat rows on flat stones like offerings to some unknown god. No one ever connected young Charles to these discoveries. He was quiet, well-mannered, got decent grades. His teachers described him as unremarkable, a word that would echo through his life like a prophecy. He had no close friends, but he didn't seem to need them. He existed in a space between noticed and invisible, exactly where predators learn to thrive. His teenage years passed in a blur of carefully maintained normalcy. He worked part-time at his father's plant, where he proved unusually adept at the butchering process. His supervisor noted that Charles never flinched at the gore, never complained about the smell. He approached each carcass with focused intensity, his cuts clean and efficient. "Boys got steady hands," the supervisor would later tell police. "Never seen anyone his age take to the work so naturally. Should have known something was wrong right there." At 17, Charles experienced what he'd later describe in his prison journals as the awakening. A classmate named Jennifer Morrison had rejected his invitation to prom. Not cruelly, just a simple, gentle no. That night, Charles lay in bed, and for the first time, the fantasies that had been abstract, distant, crystallized into something concrete and achievable. He saw himself taking Jennifer apart, layer by layer, studying the architecture of her screams, mapping the precise moment when life became death. The thought didn't horrify him. It excited him in ways he'd never experienced. He didn't act on it. Not then. Charles possessed something many killers lack: patience. He understood that impulse was the enemy of longevity. So he waited, he studied, he planned. After high school, he enrolled in a technical college, pursuing certifications in refrigeration and HVAC repair. The work gave him legitimate reasons to enter people's homes, to study their layouts, their routines, their vulnerabilities. He married young. A timid woman named Donna who worked as a librarian and who seemed grateful for any attention at all. She gave him respectability, a shield of normalcy that deflected suspicion. For 5 years, he maintained the facade. He fixed air conditioners and furnaces. He attended church on Sundays. He mowed his lawn every Saturday. And inside, the hunger grew, spreading through him like cancer, patient and inexorable. The first time he killed, Charles was 26 years old. Her name was Patricia Knowles, and she'd called him to fix her basement freezer on a sweltering July afternoon in 1978. She was 42, lived alone, worked nights as a nurse at County General. Charles had been in her home 3 times for various repairs. He'd studied her schedule, knew she had no close family, no boyfriend, no regular visitors. She was, in every practical sense, invisible to the world, just like him. When she led him down to the basement that day, his toolkit felt heavier than usual. Not because of the tools for fixing freezers, but because of the ones he'd added: the zip ties, the surgical tape, the knives he'd spent weeks sharpening to razor precision. Patricia never saw it coming. One moment she was pointing at the freezer, explaining the rattling noise. The next, Charles had looped a cord around her throat, pulling with measured pressure. Not enough to crush her windpipe immediately, but enough to cut off the blood flow to her brain. She struggled for exactly 43 seconds before her body went limp. He'd timed it. What happened next would establish the pattern he'd follow for the next 24 years. Charles laid her body out on the concrete floor with almost reverent care. He removed her clothing, folding each item neatly, as if preparing for a medical examination. Then, using the knives and tools he'd brought, he began to work. The police would later describe Patricia Knowles' murder scene as one of the most disturbing they'd encountered. Her body had been methodically dissected, organs removed and arranged, bones cleaned with such precision that forensic experts initially theorized the killer had medical training. But there was more. Charles had documented everything, taking Polaroid photographs of each stage, writing notes in a small leather journal about what he'd learned, what he'd felt, which parts had been most satisfying. He'd spent 6 hours with Patricia's body. When he finally left her basement that night, he'd cleaned everything with industrial solvents, leaving virtually no forensic evidence. The freezer he'd fixed as well, free of charge, as he'd later tell the police when they came asking routine questions. Just another service call. He barely remembered the woman. The investigation went nowhere. Patricia had no enemies, no scorned lovers, no angry relatives. The brutality of her death suggested rage, but the precision suggested calculation. The police couldn't square the circle. Eventually, her case joined the thousands of unsolved murders that pile up in filing cabinets, gathering dust and fading hope. For Charles, Patricia Knowles was a beginning. He'd crossed a threshold that can never be uncrossed, and on the other side, he'd found something that filled the emptiness inside him. Not permanently, but enough. Like an addict who'd found his drug of choice, Charles knew he'd need more. The hunger would return. It always did. He waited 16 months before killing again. This time, a young man named Thomas Chun who'd hired him to install a new heating system. Then a woman named Sarah Bridges 8 months after that. Each murder refined his technique, taught him new lessons about timing, about cleanup, about the exquisite vulnerability of the human form. And no one suspected a thing. Charles Barr remained the helpful repairman, the quiet neighbor, the unremarkable man who blended into the American landscape like wallpaper. He'd learned his parents' lessons well. How to hide damage, how to compartmentalize, how to wear humanity like a costume while something else entirely pulled the strings beneath. By the time he was 30, he'd killed 7 people. By 40, that number had doubled. And still, he moved freely through the world, fixing furnaces and taking lives with equal precision, a monster hiding in plain sight. Detective Sarah Hendricks first noticed the pattern in the spring of 2001, though she didn't know what she was seeing at the time. She'd been assigned to review cold cases for the newly formed Multi-State Homicide Task Force, a bureaucratic creation designed to identify serial offenders working across state lines. The work was tedious. Endless files, crime scene photos that blurred together, victims who'd been waiting years for justice. Then she found the anomaly. 3 murders spread across Nebraska, Iowa, and Kansas. Separated by years, different victim profiles, but sharing one disturbing commonality: the level of post-mortem mutilation. Not random violence or frenzied attacks, but careful, deliberate dissection. Organs removed with surgical precision. Bones cleaned and sometimes rearranged. Crime scenes that looked less like murders and more like autopsies performed by someone who understood anatomy at a profound level. Hendricks spent the next 6 months building her case. She cross-referenced HVAC repair records, service calls, work orders. She interviewed families who'd hired repairmen around the time their loved ones vanished. She mapped geographical patterns, looking for overlap. Charles Barr's name appeared 17 times in her investigation. 17 connections to 17 bodies found in 17 locations across the Midwest. The odds of coincidence collapsed under the weight of evidence. But knowing and proving are different things entirely. By 2002, when Hendricks finally convinced her superiors to obtain a search warrant for Charles Barr's property, he'd been killing for 24 years. His marriage to Donna had ended in divorce. She'd left him in 1995, citing emotional distance, never knowing she'd slept next to a monster for over a decade. He lived alone now in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Lincoln, Nebraska, working his repair business, maintaining his invisibility. The search of his property yielded horrors that would take investigators months to catalog. Behind a false wall in his garage, they found his trophy room. Shelves lined with jars containing preserved tissue samples from his victims. Photographs, hundreds of them, documenting every stage of every murder. The leather journals where he'd recorded his thoughts, his techniques, his evolution as a killer. He'd kept finger bones arranged in small boxes labeled with dates and initials. He'd saved locks of hair, tied with ribbon like keepsakes from a lover. Most disturbing was the video footage. Charles had begun recording his murders in the mid-1990s, once the technology became accessible and compact. The tapes showed everything: the abductions, the killings, the methodical dismemberment that followed. He narrated some of them, his voice calm and analytical, as if delivering a lecture on mechanics rather than documenting the destruction of human beings. Subject is a 34-year-old male, approximately 170 pounds. His voice came through on one tape, clinical and detached. Initial incision along the thoracic cavity reveals excellent organ preservation. Note the color of the liver. Slightly enlarged, likely alcoholic. The heart shows some arterial plaque, but otherwise healthy. Subject remained conscious longer than anticipated, approximately 4 minutes after initial cutting. Interesting data point. The subject was Marcus Wheaton, a divorced father of 2 who'd hired Charles to fix his air conditioning during a heat wave in 1997. Marcus had been reported missing, but his body was never found. The tape showed why. Charles had dissolved most of it in industrial chemicals, keeping only select pieces for his collection. When they finally arrested Charles Barr on October 18, 2002, he was fixing a furnace at an elderly widow's home. He didn't resist, didn't run. He simply set down his tools, wiped his hands on his work pants, and asked if he could grab his jacket. The widow watched in confusion as officers led away the nice young man who'd been so helpful, who'd given her a senior discount, who'd promised to check on her again next month free of charge. During interrogation, Charles was cooperative to the point of being helpful. He corrected investigators when they misidentified victims. He provided details about murders they hadn't connected to him. He drew maps showing where he'd buried remains. He explained his methods with the enthusiasm of a craftsman discussing his trade. "You want to understand why," he said during one recorded session, his voice carrying the same flat effect that characterized all his speech. "People always want to understand why, but there is no why that will satisfy you. I did it because I wanted to, because it filled something empty, because I could. Does that help?" Detective Hendricks, who conducted many of the interviews, later described the experience as profoundly unsettling. "He wasn't trying to shock us or play games," she said. "He was just explaining, the way you'd explain how to change a tire or bake a cake. There was no emotion attached to it. These people he'd tortured and killed, they weren't people to him. They were projects, materials. He felt no more remorse about them than you or I would feel about throwing away a paper cup." The body count climbed as Charles revealed his full history. 17 confirmed victims, but he insisted there were more. Some he disposed of so thoroughly that no trace remained. Others he couldn't quite remember the details of. Victims who'd blurred together over the years like watercolors running together on canvas. The youngest was 19-year-old college student named Amy Preston, killed in 1985. The oldest was 67-year-old retired teacher Gerald Mansfield, murdered in 2000. Men, women, young, old, Charles had no type beyond availability and vulnerability. He hunted opportunity, not preference. His method varied slightly with each victim, but the core remained consistent. He'd gain access through his repair business, establish trust, identify isolation. The kill itself was usually strangulation. He preferred the control it gave him, the ability to modulate pressure, to watch the exact moment life departed. Then came the part he truly savored, the methodical dismantling of the human form. "There's a beauty in understanding how things work," he told investigators. "When you open a person up, really look inside, you see the truth of what we are. Meat and fluid and electrical impulses. All this meaning we assign ourselves, all this importance, it's just story we tell. Underneath, we're just machines. Complicated ones, sure, but machines nonetheless." I just studied the blueprints more carefully than most. He described specific murders with disturbing clarity. The way Linda Hartwell's blood had pooled on her kitchen floor, creating patterns he'd photographed from multiple angles. How Robert Chang's screams had changed pitch when he realized begging wouldn't work. The surprising weight of human organs when removed from the cavity that housed them. The different textures of tissue, how muscle felt compared to fat, how tendons resisted the knife differently than skin. The families of his victims attended his trial in 2003. They sat through days of testimony, medical examiner reports, forensic evidence that painted pictures no one should have to see. Some wept openly. Others sat stone-faced, channeling their grief into silent rage. A few had to leave the courtroom when the photographs were shown. Images of their loved ones reduced to evidence, to crime scene exhibits, to proof of one man's depravity. Charles showed no reaction to their pain. He sat at the defense table, occasionally taking notes, sometimes whispering to his court-appointed lawyers, but displaying no recognition that these grieving people had any connection to him at all. When Amy Preston's mother collapsed in the gallery, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe, Charles glanced back with mild curiosity, as if observing an interesting phenomenon rather than confronting the consequences of his actions. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The defense had no real argument beyond mental illness, a claim the prosecution easily demolished by showing Charles's clear planning, his awareness of right and wrong, his efforts to avoid detection. He wasn't insane by any legal definition. He was simply evil, a word that fell out of fashion in psychiatric circles but remained the only accurate description for what Charles Barr represented. The trial of Charles Raymond Barr lasted 6 weeks and became a media sensation that gripped the nation. Court TV broadcast portions daily. Journalists packed the gallery. Outside, protesters held signs demanding death, while smaller groups of criminal psychology enthusiasts tried to understand the incomprehensible. What made Charles's case particularly disturbing wasn't just the number of victims or the brutality of their deaths, though both were staggering. It was his complete lack of remorse, combined with his willingness to explain his actions in exhaustive detail. Most serial killers, when caught, either play games with investigators or retreat into silence. Charles did neither. He talked freely, answering questions with the thoroughness of a professor giving a lecture. The prosecution called Dr. Robert Millikan, a forensic psychiatrist who'd evaluated Charles extensively. Dr. Millikan had spent over 40 hours in interview sessions, conducting batteries of psychological tests, probing the architecture of a mind that could commit such atrocities. Mr. Barr presents with what we classify as severe antisocial personality disorder, Dr. Millikan testified. But that clinical language doesn't capture the reality of what we're dealing with. He has no capacity for empathy. None. It's not that he chooses not to feel. He literally cannot. When shown images of his victims' families grieving, his brain scans show no activation in areas associated with emotional processing. He observes their pain the way you or I might observe an ant farm. Interesting, perhaps, but not personally meaningful. The doctor continued, describing Charles's childhood in clinical terms that somehow made it more horrifying. The systematic abuse, the twisted lessons from his mother, the gradual development of a psyche that saw all human interaction as manipulation, all people as objects to be used or discarded. Did his upbringing contribute to what he became? Dr. Millikan said, undoubtedly, but we must be careful not to excuse. Many people suffer terrible childhoods and don't become serial killers. Charles made choices, deliberate choices, to pursue his urges rather than resist them. His intelligence, and he is quite intelligent, made him more dangerous, not less culpable. When Charles himself took the stand, the courtroom fell into a silence so complete you could hear the air conditioning humming. His attorneys had advised against it, but Charles insisted. He wanted to speak. For 3 days, he answered questions from both prosecution and defense. He described his crimes without euphemism or deflection. He walked the jury through his mental processes, explaining how he selected victims, how he planned each murder to minimize risk, how he'd refined his techniques over decades. The first few were messy, he said, his tone suggesting he was discussing amateur carpentry rather than murder. I didn't understand the proper sequence for organ removal. I damaged the liver on my second victim, cut too deep, nicked it with the blade. But you learn. You improve. By my 10th, I could complete a full dissection in under 2 hours with minimal waste. The prosecutor, a tenacious woman named Margaret Chen, tried to break through his clinical detachment. Mr. Barr, when you were cutting into Patricia Knowles, your first victim, did you think about the fact that she was a person? That she had a life? Friends? People who loved her? Charles considered the question with apparent seriousness. I thought about her anatomy, about whether I was making the incisions correctly, about what I might learn. Her personhood wasn't relevant to the work I was doing. Does a surgeon think about the patient's favorite color when he's operating? The human elements are just noise, distractions from the actual task. The actual task of murdering her, Chen pressed. The actual task of understanding her, Charles corrected. Murder was just the prerequisite, the gateway. What came after was the point. Chun played portions of his video recordings for the jury. Even with the most graphic portions edited out for legal reasons, the footage was damning. Charles's calm narration as he worked, the clinical environment he'd created, the careful documentation of every cut, every discovery. In one particularly chilling segment, Charles had filmed himself talking directly to the camera, a practice he'd apparently developed later in his killing career. Today is March 15, 1999, his recorded voice said. Subject is a 41-year-old female, Hispanic, approximately 130 pounds. She remained conscious longer than average, nearly 6 minutes after the initial thoracic incision. The sounds she made were interesting, not quite words, more like attempts at words. The neurology of pain and speech production when the diaphragm is compromised, that's worth further observation. The subject was Maria Gonzalez, a single mother of 3 who'd hired Charles to install a new water heater. Her children had waited days for her to come home before calling police. The case had gone cold until Charles's arrest. Several jurors wept watching the footage. One requested a recess, unable to continue. Charles watched his own recordings with what appeared to be professional interest, occasionally nodding as if remembering particular details. The defense attempted to present mitigating factors, the abuse, the mother's influence, the possible neurological abnormalities that might explain his inability to feel empathy. They brought in their own experts who discussed brain chemistry and childhood trauma, painting a picture of a man whose capacity for normal human emotion had been destroyed before he'd even had a chance. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They called survivors, people who'd hired Charles for repair work and lived only because circumstances prevented him from acting. These witnesses described his behavior as perfectly normal, polite, professional, forgettable. He'd shown no signs of the monster lurking beneath. He'd controlled himself perfectly when it suited his purposes. This is not a man driven by uncontrollable impulses, Chan argued in her closing statement. This is a man who controlled himself with extraordinary discipline for over 2 decades. He held a job. He maintained relationships. He filed taxes and mowed his lawn and smiled at neighbors. He controlled himself perfectly until he decided not to, until he found someone vulnerable enough, isolated enough, that he could indulge his desires without consequences. That's not mental illness. That's calculation. That's choice. And that's why he deserves no mercy. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours. Guilty on all 17 counts of first-degree murder. Guilty on multiple counts of kidnapping, torture, and abuse of a corpse. When the verdict was read, Charles showed no reaction. He simply nodded slightly, as if confirming an expected result. The sentencing phase brought victim impact statements. For 2 days, families stood before the court and described the holes Charles had torn in their lives. Fathers who would never walk their daughters down the aisle. Children who grew up without parents. Siblings who still set an extra place at holiday tables out of habit, forgetting for just a moment that their brother or sister was never coming home. Patricia Knowles' sister, Deborah, spoke through tears. She was going to visit me that weekend. We were going to go shopping, have lunch, just spend time together like we always did. Instead, I got a phone call from the police saying they'd found her. They wouldn't let me see her. They said I shouldn't, that I should remember her how she was. For 24 years, I've wondered what he did to her that was so terrible they couldn't even let me say goodbye. Now I know, and I'll never sleep soundly again. Thomas Chen's elderly mother spoke in halting English, her son translating from Mandarin. My Thomas was good boy. He called every Sunday. He helped me with groceries. He was going to take me to China to visit family. This man took all that, took my son, took my future. I am 83 years old, and I will die knowing my child died in terror and pain. What justice can fix that? The judge, a stern woman named Harriet Blackwell who'd presided over hundreds of cases, took the unusual step of addressing Charles directly before imposing sentence. Mr. Barr, I have sat on this bench for 26 years. I have seen every variation of human cruelty this world offers. But I have never encountered someone quite like you. Not because of what you did, though those crimes are monstrous, but because of what you are. You have shown us the face of true psychopathy, unfiltered and unapologetic. You have demonstrated that evil is not always the product of passion or rage. Sometimes it is cold, calculated, and utterly empty of humanity. The law requires me to sentence you, but no sentence I impose can address what you truly deserve. That reckoning, if it comes, will not be in this court. She sentenced him to 17 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. In addition, she recommended he be held in administrative segregation for the safety of other inmates and prison staff. Charles would spend the rest of his life in a concrete box, alone with his memories and his journals, which the court had allowed him to keep under supervised conditions. As marshals led him from the courtroom, Charles paused. For the first time, he looked directly at the families of his victims. What passed across his face was hard to read. Not quite curiosity, not quite recognition, just a brief acknowledgement of their existence before he turned away, shuffling toward whatever future waited in his cell. The administrative maximum facility in Florence, Colorado, known as ADX or Supermax, became Charles Barr's permanent home in 2004. The prison houses America's most dangerous criminals. Terrorists, gang leaders, serial killers whose names have become synonymous with horror. Charles fit seamlessly into this catalog of nightmares. His cell measured 7 by 12 feet. Concrete walls, concrete bed, concrete desk and stool, a shower that ran on a timer, a slot in the door for food delivery, a single window 4 inches wide, designed to prevent prisoners from determining their location within the facility. 23 hours a day in this box. 1 hour for solitary exercise in a slightly larger concrete pen. For most inmates, this isolation breaks something fundamental. Humans are social creatures. Prolonged solitude can shatter the mind, producing hallucinations, paranoia, regression. But Charles was not most inmates. If anything, isolation suited him. No need to perform normalcy. No need to pretend interest in the tedious concerns of others. Just him and his thoughts and the memories of what he'd done. He was allowed books, writing materials, and limited visits from researchers who'd received special permission to study him. Over the next decade, Charles became something of a phenomenon in criminal psychology circles. A willing subject who could articulate his internal processes with disturbing clarity. Dr. Patricia Ventura, a forensic psychologist from Harvard, spent 5 years interviewing Charles for a comprehensive study on psychopathy and serial murder. Her published work, The Architecture of Emptiness, drew heavily on their conversations. Charles described his emotional landscape as fundamentally different from normal human experience. She wrote, "He doesn't feel emptiness as a negative state. He simply exists in a kind of neutral baseline. Killing didn't fill him with joy or satisfaction in the way we understand those emotions. It was more like scratching an itch, a temporary relief from a mild discomfort. When I asked if he missed it, he said he missed the intellectual challenge of planning and execution, but not the acts themselves. They were simply what he did, like asking if he misses breathing. Charles's journals from prison revealed a mind still cataloging, still analyzing, even without access to new victims. He wrote extensively about his past murders, adding details he'd forgotten during interrogation. He sketched diagrams of human anatomy from memory, annotating them with observations from his experiences. He composed what he called theoretical frameworks, essays on how he might have improved his methods, what mistakes he'd made, what he'd learned too late to implement. None of it showed remorse. Regret, perhaps, but only for tactical errors. He regretted getting caught, not the suffering he'd caused. Prison officials monitored his writings carefully, concerned about the possibility that he might inspire copycat crimes. But Charles insisted his work was purely academic. "I'm documenting a particular skill set," he wrote in one journal entry. "Future researchers might find value in understanding the mindset. I'm not encouraging anyone. I'm simply recording what was." He received letters, dozens every week. Some from victims' families, filled with rage and grief and questions that had no satisfying answers. He never responded to these, but he did reply to letters from the morbidly curious, the true crime enthusiasts, the people fascinated by monsters. His responses were polite, informative, and utterly devoid of humanity. One exchange, later published by a journalist, showed his typical approach. Letter from correspondent. "What did you feel when you killed them?" Charles's response. "Feel is the wrong word. I observed. I processed. I cataloged data. Imagine you're assembling furniture from a kit. You don't feel emotions about the screws and bolts. You just focus on the assembly. That's the closest analogy I can provide." Correspondent. "But they were people. How could you not see them as people?" Charles. "I saw them as complex biological systems. Your question assumes my perception matches yours. Doesn't. Asking me to see them as people is like asking a colorblind person to appreciate a sunset. The neurological hardware simply isn't there." The years passed slowly in his concrete box. Charles developed routines, exercise regimens, reading schedules, structured time for writing and reflection. He aged quietly, his hair turning gray, his body softening from lack of movement. But his mind remained sharp, cataloging and analyzing even as the world outside changed and moved on. In 2012, Detective Sarah Hendricks, now retired from active police work, visited him. She'd devoted years to catching him, and part of her needed to understand what she'd caught. They sat across from each other in a small interview room, separated by reinforced glass. Charles looked older, smaller somehow, diminished by years of confinement. But his eyes held the same flat effect she remembered from interrogations. "Why did you agree to see me?" Hendricks asked. "Professional courtesy," Charles replied. "You did your job well. I did mine. We both understand our respective crafts. Murder isn't a craft. Of course it is. Every action requiring skill and practice is a craft. Society's moral judgment doesn't change the technical reality." Hendricks had prepared questions, but found herself asking something else entirely. "Do you ever think about them? The people you killed?" Charles considered this carefully. "I think about the work, the challenges each one presented, the solutions I developed, the individuals themselves." He shook his head slightly. "They were necessary components of the work, but not the point of it." "Do you think about every criminal you arrested? Remember their names? Their faces, their personal details?" "That's different. Is it? Or do we both simply categorize people differently? You see citizens and criminals. I saw materials and opportunities. Both are reductive frameworks. Neither treats people as fully realized humans. You're just more socially acceptable." The comparison was obscene, but Hendricks couldn't entirely refute it. She'd spent decades seeing people as cases, as clearance rates, as statistics in departmental reports. The difference, of course, was that she'd never tortured and murdered anyone. Intent mattered, outcome mattered, but Charles had made his point. From his perspective, he was simply operating under a different moral framework. One where traditional ethics didn't apply because he fundamentally didn't process human connection the way others did. The families, Hendricks tried again. Their pain. Does that mean anything to you? I understand it intellectually, Charles said. Loss produces grief. Grief produces specific behavioral and chemical responses. But do I feel anything about their pain? No. Should I? Probably according to social norms. But I don't. I never will. That capacity was either never developed or damaged too early to repair. So what's the point of pretending? Hendricks left that meeting feeling worse than when she'd arrived. She'd wanted some glimpse of humanity, some crack in the armor that would confirm that Charles was still, fundamentally, a person. Instead, she'd found exactly what she'd always known. A void in human form, capable of mimicking connection but utterly incapable of experiencing it. In 2018, Charles developed prostate cancer. He declined treatment. When asked why, he explained that he'd lived long enough to satisfy his curiosity about aging in confinement. He documented the experience thoroughly. Further extension seemed redundant. He died on March 22, 2019, at age 67, alone in his cell. Prison officials found him in his bunk, his journal open beside him. The final entry read, "Physical systems degrade. Cellular processes become inefficient. This is expected. The machine winds down. No particular meaning attaches to this beyond biological inevitability." His body was cremated according to his wishes. No service was held. No one claimed his ashes. The prison disposed of them according to standard protocol. His victims' families received notification of his death. Reactions varied. Some felt relief that he could never hurt anyone again. Others felt cheated. Death was too easy, too quick, compared to what he'd inflicted. A few felt nothing at all. They'd moved on years ago, built lives around the holes he'd left, and his death changed nothing fundamental. The case files remain in storage, 17 thick folders documenting 17 destroyed lives and the monster who destroyed them. Law enforcement academies still use his case as a teaching tool, an example of how serial killers can operate successfully for decades by exploiting trust and maintaining superficial normalcy. Charles Barr killed 17 people over 24 years. He dismantled them methodically, documented everything, felt nothing. He lived 77 years total, and for 67 of them, he was a predator wearing human skin. The world has forgotten him now, mostly. His name doesn't carry the same recognition as Bundy or Dahmer or Gacy. He wasn't theatrical enough, wasn't quotable enough, wasn't interested in fame or infamy. He just was what he was, a perfect killing machine in imperfect human form. His victims, though, they deserve remembrance. Patricia Knowles, Thomas Chen, Sarah Bridges, and 14 others whose names and stories shouldn't be overshadowed by the man who murdered them. They were people with lives and dreams and futures, all stolen by someone who saw them as nothing more than objects to study and discard. That's the real horror of Charles Barr's story. Not just what he did, but what he represented. The terrifying possibility that empathy, conscience, and human connection, the things we assume are universal, are actually optional features, and some people are simply born without them, or have them destroyed so early and so thoroughly that they never develop at all. We want monsters to look like monsters. We want them to be obvious, identifiable, avoidable. But Charles looked like everyone else. He talked like everyone else. He walked among us undetected for decades. And the disturbing truth is that right now, statistically, there are others like him out there, functioning, hiding, waiting. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Surgeon of Slaughter. How a trusted healer became death's architect. Behind the sterile white walls where humanity seeks salvation, a monster wore a stethoscope and wielded instruments of mercy as tools of extinction, transforming operating theaters into abattoirs where trust became the currency of death. What transforms a man sworn to preserve life into an architect of systematic destruction? Patrick Baxter didn't simply kill his patients. He orchestrated their departures with the calculated precision of someone who understood exactly how fragile the thread between existence and oblivion truly was. This wasn't madness born of impulse or rage. This was deliberate, methodical, a campaign of termination conducted beneath fluorescent lights, shielded by the very authority granted to those who pledged to do no harm. The patients arrived seeking healing. They left in body bags, their final breaths stolen by hands they trusted implicitly. This is the chronicle of medicine's darkest betrayal, where approximately 400 souls, mothers, fathers, children, the elderly, vanished into permanent silence because one man decided their worth, their futures, their very existence held no value in his twisted calculus. Welcome to the anatomy of institutional murder, where death wore scrubs and signed charts with the same hand that accelerated its arrival. The year was 1991 when Patrick Baxter first stepped into Stepping Hill Hospital in Stockport, England, carrying credentials that should have inspired confidence. His qualifications appeared impeccable on paper. A trained physician with specialized knowledge in geriatric care, precisely the expertise needed for a facility serving the region's most vulnerable population. The elderly patients who filled those wards arrived broken by age, disease, and the accumulated traumas of long lives. They came seeking comfort in their twilight hours, medical intervention for failing systems, and perhaps the dignity of a peaceful conclusion when their time naturally arrived. None suspected that their healer would become their executioner. Baxter integrated seamlessly into the hospital's fabric, his demeanor calm and professional. Colleagues observed a physician who seemed dedicated, perhaps even unusually attentive to his patients. He worked long hours, volunteered for additional shifts, and demonstrated particular interest in the wards housing the most critically ill. To supervisors, this appeared as admirable commitment. To fellow staff members, it registered as the behavior of someone truly devoted to his calling. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, something entirely different was unfolding. A campaign of calculated termination that would ultimately claim hundreds of lives. The method Baxter employed revealed both his medical knowledge and his complete absence of conscience. Diamorphine, a powerful opioid commonly used in palliative care to ease suffering in terminal patients, became his weapon of choice. In therapeutic doses, this medication provides merciful relief from unbearable pain. In the quantities Baxter administered, it became a chemical executioner, shutting down respiratory systems, depressing cardiac function, and ushering patients into a darkness from which they would never emerge. The elegance of his approach, if such horror can be described with that word, lay in its apparent legitimacy. Elderly patients in hospitals die with unfortunate regularity. A death in a geriatric ward, particularly among those already gravely ill, rarely triggers intense scrutiny. Baxter exploited this reality with chilling effectiveness. His victims spanned the spectrum of human frailty. Some were indeed terminally ill, their bodies already surrendering to cancer, organ failure, or the cascading complications of advanced age. Others, however, possessed conditions entirely treatable, infections that antibiotics could conquer, cardiovascular issues that medication could manage, orthopedic injuries that would heal with time and proper care. Baxter made no such distinctions. His selection criteria remain opaque even to those who later investigated his crimes. Was it convenience? Did certain patients irritate him with their demands or complaints? Did he view himself as some perverse angel of mercy, deciding who deserved continued existence? Or was it simpler and more terrifying? Did he kill simply because he could, because the power over life and death provided satisfaction that normal existence could not? The families of his victims experienced the unique anguish of unexpected loss compounded by misplaced gratitude. They thanked Baxter for his care even as he signed death certificates documenting departures he had orchestrated. They wept in corridors while he offered comfort, his expressions of sympathy masking the reality that he had just committed murder. Imagine the psychological violence of that deception. Grieving relatives shaking the hand that had just administered a fatal dose, believing they were encountering compassion when they were actually facing a predator who had consumed their loved one. The hospital environment itself became Baxter's accomplice. Medical facilities operate on systems of trust and professional autonomy. Physicians, particularly those with specialized credentials, enjoy considerable latitude in treatment decisions. Medication access, while theoretically controlled, presents minimal barriers to those with proper authorization. Chart documentation, if completed with apparent thoroughness, rarely faces challenge. Baxter navigated these systems expertly, his actions shielded by institutional assumptions that doctors fundamentally work in their patients' interests. Each fraudulent notation, each falsified dosage record, each fabricated justification for medication administration built the fortress within which he operated unchallenged. Patterns emerged slowly, too slowly for those who would eventually die. Mortality rates in Baxter's wards climbed, but statistical variations can occur for numerous legitimate reasons. Perhaps the patient population had become more acutely ill. Perhaps seasonal factors contributed to increased vulnerability. Perhaps coincidence explained the clustering of deaths during Baxter's shifts. Hospital administrators, if they noticed at all, likely attributed the numbers to unfortunate circumstances rather than homicidal intervention. This delay, this failure of institutional vigilance, allowed the body count to accumulate with horrifying efficiency. The diamorphine itself worked with brutal reliability. Patients would receive their injection, administered by Baxter with the same clinical competence that characterized all his medical procedures. Within minutes, the drug would begin its work, respiratory depression initiating as the central nervous system succumbed to opioid suppression. Breathing would become shallow, labored, then increasingly irregular. Oxygen levels would plummet. The heart, deprived of adequate oxygenation and directly depressed by the medication's effects, would begin to fail. Some patients likely experienced moments of awareness as their bodies shut down, a terrifying recognition that something was profoundly wrong. Others perhaps slipped into unconsciousness more gradually, their final thoughts confused and afraid. Either way, the conclusion was identical: cessation of all vital functions, death declared, another chart closed, another family notified of their loss. Baxter's psychological landscape remains largely inaccessible despite subsequent investigation and prosecution. What internal narrative justified such sustained killing? Did he experience remorse, excitement, satisfaction, or complete emotional detachment? Serial killers typically demonstrate identifiable psychological patterns. Needs for control, sexual gratification, power, or attention. Baxter's motivations appear more opaque, perhaps because the medical setting provided both camouflage and rationalization. He killed not in dark alleys or secluded locations, but in places explicitly dedicated to healing, surrounded by colleagues and equipment designed to preserve life. This contradiction, healing spaces converted to execution chambers, adds layers of psychological complexity to already incomprehensible acts. The patients themselves existed as individuals with histories, relationships, and futures that Baxter extinguished. Among the estimated 400 victims were people celebrating grandchildren's births, couples married for half a century, individuals with plans extending beyond their current hospitalization. They possessed memories spanning decades, contributions to communities, connections to others whose lives were irrevocably damaged by their premature departures. Baxter erased all of this with clinical efficiency, reducing human beings to entries in medical records, their lives condensed to a few lines noting time of death and presumed cause. Understanding how Baxter sustained his campaign of extermination requires examining the specific mechanisms he exploited and the institutional vulnerabilities that enabled such prolonged killing. The pharmaceutical landscape of British hospitals in the early 1990s, while regulated, contained gaps that a knowledgeable and determined physician could navigate. Diamorphine, despite its potency, was readily available in wards treating seriously ill patients. Its legitimate medical applications meant that doctors ordered and administered it routinely. Tracking systems existed but relied heavily on honest documentation. Baxter simply lied. Each murder followed a similar architecture. Baxter would identify a target. The selection process itself remains mysterious. though investigators later noted that many victims were elderly patients whose deaths would appear unsurprising. He would access the medication storage, withdrawing quantities of diamorphine far exceeding therapeutic needs. The drug would be prepared, drawn into syringes with the same mechanical precision that characterized legitimate medical procedures. Then came the approach to the patient's bedside, the reassuring words perhaps, the insertion of the needle, the depression of the plunger, and the irreversible cascade toward death. The immediate aftermath of each killing demonstrated Baxter's understanding of hospital procedures and his ability to manipulate them. He would remain present as patients deteriorated, performing resuscitation attempts that he knew would fail because he had ensured their failure. He would summon colleagues, creating witnesses to his apparent efforts to save lives he had just taken. He would document everything meticulously, vital signs, interventions attempted, times noted with precision. These records served dual purposes. They provided legal documentation of death, and they constructed narratives of natural expiration or unavoidable medical crisis. The paperwork became camouflage. Each completed form another layer of protection against discovery. Colleagues working alongside Baxter noticed nothing because they expected nothing. The concept of a physician systematically murdering patients contradicts fundamental assumptions about medical professionals. Doctors undergo years of training emphasizing the sanctity of life and the ethical obligations of their profession. The Hippocratic principle of first, do no harm represents not merely a philosophical guideline but a foundational identity for those who practice medicine. Baxter's co-workers couldn't conceive that someone wearing the same uniform, carrying the same credentials, speaking the same professional language could be actively killing. This cognitive dissonance, the impossibility of reconciling professional identity with homicidal reality, created a perceptual blind spot that Baxter exploited ruthlessly. The victims' families, as mentioned, experienced compounded trauma. Initial grief at losing a loved one was later transformed into something far worse when Baxter's crimes eventually surfaced. Imagine learning years after a parent's death that their departure wasn't natural, wasn't the peaceful conclusion of a life well lived, but was instead murder. That knowledge retroactively poisons every memory of the hospital stay, every interaction with staff, every moment of the grieving process. The comfort initially derived from believing a loved one received good care evaporates, replaced by rage, betrayal, and the unbearable knowledge that death was delivered by the very person entrusted with providing healing. The sheer scale of Baxter's killing distinguishes him within the grim pantheon of medical murderers. While exact victim counts remain subject to investigation limitations, many potential cases involve patients long deceased whose remains were cremated, eliminating possibilities for forensic confirmation. Credible estimates place the death toll around 400 individuals. This number exceeds the confirmed victims of virtually every serial killer in documented history. The magnitude becomes even more staggering when considering the compressed time frame. Baxter's active killing period spanned years rather than decades, suggesting an average of multiple murders per week during certain periods. This wasn't occasional homicide driven by specific triggers or circumstances. This was industrial-scale killing, systematic and sustained. The methods employed, while primarily centered on diamorphine overdose, may have included variations. Investigations later explored whether Baxter also used insulin, potassium chloride, or other substances capable of inducing fatal medical crises. Insulin, administered in excessive quantities, triggers profound hypoglycemia, blood sugar crashes that can cause seizures, coma, and death. Potassium chloride, injected directly, induces cardiac arrest by disrupting the electrical systems governing heartbeat. These alternatives would have provided Baxter with options when diamorphine seemed inappropriate or unavailable. Each substance presented distinct advantages. Insulin overdoses could mimic diabetic emergencies, potassium injections could simulate heart attacks, and all left minimal forensic traces if administered carefully. Patients experienced their final moments in varying states of awareness. Some, already heavily sedated or deeply unconscious from underlying illness, likely transitioned from their existing stupor directly into death without full comprehension of what was occurring. Others, particularly those less critically ill whom Baxter targeted nonetheless, may have felt the medication's effects with terrifying clarity. The sensation of respiratory depression, the inability to draw adequate breath, the panic as oxygen levels fall, the desperate gasping that accomplishes nothing, represents one of the most frightening ways to die. Imagine lying in a hospital bed, already vulnerable and afraid, only to experience your breathing becoming impossibly difficult while the person who should be helping stands watching with clinical detachment, knowing he has caused exactly what is happening. The physical process of diamorphine-induced death unfolds with grim predictability. Initially, patients experience euphoria and pain relief as the opioid binds to receptors throughout the nervous system. This brief period of comfort quickly transitions as dosages exceed therapeutic ranges. Respiratory rate decreases, 12 breaths per minute becoming 10, then 8, then 6. Each breath becomes shallower, moving less air. Carbon dioxide accumulates in the bloodstream as oxygen delivery fails. The heart, struggling to compensate, initially accelerates but soon begins irregular rhythms as hypoxia damages cardiac muscle. Pupils constrict to pinpoints, skin becomes mottled, then cyanotic as circulation collapses. Consciousness fades, sometimes gradually, sometimes precipitously. Eventually, breathing ceases entirely. The heart continues briefly, individual chambers fibrillating uselessly before final electrical silence. Death is declared. Another victim claimed. Baxter's emotional state during these episodes remains completely unknown. Did he feel excitement, observing his handiwork as patients died? Did he experience satisfaction from exercising ultimate control? Was there sexual gratification, as some forensic psychologists have speculated about medical killers? Or did he feel nothing, completely detached, viewing patients as objects rather than human beings, their deaths as meaningless as discarding broken equipment? The absence of clear motive makes psychological reconstruction particularly challenging. Most serial killers demonstrate recognizable patterns connecting their crimes to psychological needs or wounds. Baxter's pattern was killing itself, stripped of obvious secondary motivations. The institutional failure that enabled such prolonged murder extends beyond simple oversight. Hospitals create hierarchical structures where physicians occupy positions of considerable authority. Nurses, who spend more direct time with patients and might notice irregularities, often hesitate to challenge doctors' decisions due to professional power dynamics. Even when questions arise, the complexity of medical treatment provides numerous opportunities for plausible explanations. A patient who deteriorated unexpectedly? Perhaps their underlying condition was more serious than initially apparent. Medications that seemed excessive? Perhaps the physician was responding to symptoms not immediately obvious to others. Deaths clustered during particular shifts? Perhaps coincidence? Perhaps that physician was simply assigned to care for the most critical patients. Each potential warning sign could be rationalized away, and apparently was for years. Every sustained criminal enterprise eventually encounters its terminus, whether through investigative diligence, perpetrator error, or the simple mathematics of probability. The more frequently crimes occur, the greater the likelihood that patterns will emerge and scrutiny will intensify. For Patrick Baxter, the beginning of the end arrived not from a single dramatic revelation, but from the gradual accumulation of concerns that finally exceeded the threshold required to trigger serious investigation. The exact catalyst remains somewhat obscured in available records, but what is clear is that by the mid-1990s, questions were being raised about the mortality patterns in wards where Baxter worked. Nurses, those frontline observers who spend hours at patients' bedsides, began comparing experiences and observations. Conversations in break rooms and during shift changes turned toward troubling coincidences. Patients who seemed stable would deteriorate suddenly during Baxter's rounds. Deaths seemed disproportionately clustered during periods when he was on duty. Medication usage appeared unusually high. Individually, each observation could be dismissed. Collectively, they formed a mosaic suggesting something deeply wrong. The challenge for these nurses involved navigating the professional and institutional barriers to raising such serious allegations against a physician. Accusing a doctor of murder risks career destruction if wrong, invites institutional retaliation for disrupting operations, and requires overcoming powerful psychological resistance to believing such evil could exist within their workplace. Eventually, concerns reached administrators who could not simply dismiss them. Hospital officials faced their own agonizing decisions. Investigating a physician for serial murder would inevitably become public, devastating the institution's reputation even if allegations proved unfounded. Families of deceased patients would demand answers, media would descend, lawsuits would proliferate. The easier path involved continued rationalization. Perhaps the concerns were overblown, perhaps statistics were being misinterpreted, perhaps there were explanations that preserved everyone's peace. But the weight of accumulating evidence and the moral obligation to patients finally overcame institutional inertia. Authorities were contacted. An investigation commenced. The police inquiry that followed had to navigate extraordinary complexity. Unlike typical murder investigations where bodies provide forensic evidence and timelines are compressed, this case involved hundreds of potential victims across years, many already cremated, with deaths initially certified as natural. Investigators needed to reconstruct medication records, interview countless staff members, examine patient charts for irregularities, and attempt to distinguish between deaths that were truly natural versus those that were criminally induced. The task was monumental and, in many ways, impossible to complete with absolute certainty regarding every potential victim. Forensic examination of available remains, those patients whose families had chosen burial rather than cremation, became crucial. Toxicological analysis could potentially reveal diamorphine concentrations inconsistent with therapeutic administration. However, significant challenges complicated this work. Diamorphine metabolizes rapidly in the body, breaking down into morphine and other compounds. Time elapsed since death degraded evidence further. Embalming processes introduced chemicals that could interfere with analysis. Despite these obstacles, forensic pathologists were able to identify several cases where drug concentrations strongly suggested deliberate overdose rather than appropriate medical treatment. Examination of hospital records revealed damning patterns. Medication logs showed Baxter accessing diamorphine with suspicious frequency. Patient charts contained dosage notations that exceeded standard protocols. Death certificates signed by Baxter demonstrated statistical clustering that probability calculations indicated could not reasonably be coincidental. Witness statements from nurses described Baxter's unusual interest in certain patients and his presence during deteriorations that seemed medically unexpected. The circumstantial case grew increasingly substantial even as the challenge of proving individual murders beyond reasonable doubt remained formidable. Baxter's arrest, when it finally occurred, marked a watershed moment for Stepping Hill Hospital and the broader community. The revelation that a physician, a figure society trusts implicitly with its most vulnerable members, stood accused of serial murder sent shockwaves through Stockport and beyond. Media coverage exploded, with journalists descending on the hospital and attempting to interview anyone connected to the case. Families of deceased patients experienced renewed trauma, suddenly forced to confront the possibility that their loved ones had been murdered. Hospital staff grappled with guilt, anger, and disbelief. How had this continued for so long? How had no one recognized what was happening? Why hadn't concerns been raised earlier or taken more seriously? The legal proceedings that followed demonstrated the immense challenges in prosecuting medical murder cases. Prosecutors needed to prove not merely that patients died while under Baxter's care, an unremarkable occurrence in hospital settings, but that he intentionally killed them through deliberate overdose. This required establishing that medication quantities exceeded any legitimate therapeutic purpose, that Baxter's actions directly caused death rather than underlying illness, and that he possessed the requisite criminal intent. Defense attorneys would inevitably argue that patients were gravely ill, that deaths were natural or resulted from complications, and that medication decisions represented clinical judgment rather than homicidal intent. The prosecution built its case methodically, focusing on instances where evidence was strongest. Expert witnesses testified about standard medical practices and how Baxter's actions deviated dramatically from accepted protocols. Toxicologists presented findings about drug concentrations in exhumed remains. Statistical analysts explained the mathematical improbability of the death patterns observed. Nurses provided testimony about Baxter's behavior and the concerns they had harbored. Family members described their loved ones' conditions prior to final deteriorations, establishing that patients were not as critically ill as Baxter's documentation suggested. The cumulative weight of evidence painted a portrait of systematic killing dressed in the language and trappings of legitimate medical care. Baxter's defense strategy, while not publicly detailed in full, presumably centered on attacking the reliability of forensic evidence, emphasizing the complexity of medical decision-making, and highlighting the serious underlying illnesses affecting many alleged victims. His attorneys would have stressed the heavy burden of proof in criminal cases and the dangers of convicting based on statistical patterns and circumstantial evidence. They might have portrayed Baxter as a dedicated physician making difficult decisions in challenging circumstances, arguing that retrospective second-guessing of medical judgments does not constitute evidence of murder. The jury, composed of ordinary citizens without medical expertise, faced the extraordinary responsibility of determining whether a physician had systematically murdered patients. They needed to comprehend complex medical testimony, evaluate conflicting expert opinions, assess the credibility of witnesses whose observations spanned years, and ultimately decide whether the prosecution had proven guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The psychological weight of such deliberations must have been crushing. Finding Baxter guilty meant acknowledging that hundreds of people had been murdered in a place dedicated to healing, while acquitting him meant potentially allowing a serial killer to escape justice. The verdict, when delivered, reverberated far beyond the courtroom. Baxter was convicted of multiple counts of murder, with the exact number reflecting those cases where evidence met the stringent legal standards required for conviction. The actual victim count, estimated at 400 based on statistical analysis and investigation findings, far exceeded the murder counts in the formal verdict, but evidentiary limitations prevented prosecution of every suspected killing. This gap between probable reality and provable cases represents one of the enduring frustrations of the case. Hundreds of families will never receive definitive answers about whether their loved ones were murdered, living instead with terrible suspicion but without conclusive confirmation. Sentencing brought its own complexities. British law, having abolished the death penalty, offered life imprisonment as the maximum punishment. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, acknowledged the unprecedented scale of Baxter's crimes and the profound betrayal of professional trust they represented. Multiple life sentences were imposed, with recommendations regarding minimum terms before parole eligibility. The practical reality was clear. Baxter would die in prison, never again walking free, his remaining years spent confined within the justice system he had evaded for so long. The conviction's aftermath triggered institutional reckoning across British healthcare. How had a physician been able to kill hundreds of patients without detection? What systemic failures enabled such sustained criminality? How could hospitals prevent similar horrors? These questions demanded answers that went beyond Baxter's individual pathology to examine the structures, cultures, and oversight mechanisms within medical facilities. Investigations revealed troubling patterns, inadequate medication tracking, insufficient scrutiny of mortality statistics, hierarchical cultures that discouraged questioning of physicians, and complaint systems that failed to act on early warnings. The conclusion of Patrick Baxter's trial marked not an ending but a transition into different forms of anguish and reckoning. For families of confirmed victims, the verdict provided a measure of justice but could never restore what was stolen. Parents, children, spouses, and siblings of the murdered patients faced the impossible task of processing grief, compounded by betrayal. Their loved ones had entered a hospital seeking healing and instead encountered a predator. The trust they placed in the medical system, a trust society conditions us to maintain, had been weaponized against the most vulnerable people in their lives. Consider the specific psychological torture these families endured. Unlike victims of most murders, who die in circumstances that immediately reveal criminality, Baxter's victims died in ways initially perceived as natural. Families grieved, held funerals, gradually adapted to loss, and moved forward with lives forever altered but eventually stabilized. Then came the revelation, years later in many cases, that death had not been natural but was instead murder. This knowledge forced a complete recontextualization of everything. Memories of final hospital visits became tainted. Gratitude previously felt toward medical staff transformed into rage. The peaceful death initially believed became horror at learning a loved one was systematically killed. Grief was resurrected and amplified, now accompanied by fury and betrayal. The families of probable victims, those 400- convicted count cases where evidence suggested murder but could not definitively prove it, faced perhaps even worse torture. They lived with terrible suspicion but without confirmation, unable to achieve the closure that certainty, however awful, provides. Questions haunted them. Was my mother murdered? Did my father die naturally, or was he killed? Should I have noticed something? Could I have prevented it? These unanswerable questions inflicted ongoing psychological damage, a wound that could not heal because it could never be properly identified. Hospital staff experienced their own trauma. Nurses who had worked alongside Baxter questioned their judgment and awareness. Should they have recognized signs earlier? Were their concerns dismissed too readily? Did their silence contribute to additional deaths? Physicians grappled with the realization that someone within their profession had perverted medical knowledge into instruments of murder. The entire staff faced public scrutiny and suspicion. Had others been involved or willfully blind? The hospital itself struggled to rebuild trust within a community that now viewed it with fear and anger rather than confidence. Stepping Hill Hospital underwent extensive reforms in Baxter's wake. Medication tracking systems were revolutionized, implementing multiple verification requirements and automated monitoring. Mortality statistics received regular review with protocols for investigating concerning patterns. Professional hierarchies were flattened enough to encourage reporting of concerns without fear of retaliation. Training programs emphasized recognition of potential medical murder and the ethical obligations to report suspicions. These changes, while necessary, came too late for the 400 estimated victims whose deaths prompted the reforms. The broader medical community in Britain and internationally confronted uncomfortable questions about vulnerability to similar perpetrators. Baxter was not the first medical professional to commit serial murder. History records numerous physicians and nurses who killed patients, but the scale of his crimes demanded systemic response. Medical boards strengthened oversight mechanisms. Hospitals implemented peer review processes designed to detect aberrant practices. Professional organizations developed guidelines for responding to concerns about colleagues. Yet fundamental challenges remained. Medical environments necessarily grant significant autonomy to practitioners. Patients frequently die from natural causes that can mask criminal acts, and the cognitive dissonance preventing people from suspecting doctors of murder continues to exist. Baxter himself, imprisoned for life, became a subject of forensic psychological fascination. Researchers sought to understand what created such a killer. Was there developmental trauma that seeded homicidal tendencies? Did he experience a psychological break that transformed him from healer to murderer? Or was he always fundamentally pathological, attracted to medicine specifically because it provided access to victims and methods of killing? Interviews with Baxter, assuming he participated in any, might have provided insights, but even cooperative subjects often lack genuine self-awareness about their motivations. Psychopaths, which Baxter may well be, frequently rationalize their actions through distorted logic that bears little relationship to objective reality. The question of motive continued to perplex investigators and psychologists. Financial gain did not appear relevant. Baxter derived no monetary benefit from killing patients. Sexual gratification seemed unlikely given the demographics of his victims and absence of evidence suggesting sexual component to the crimes. Power and control represented plausible motivations. Deciding who lived and died certainly exercised ultimate power. Some theorized that Baxter viewed himself as delivering mercy, ending lives he deemed not worth continuing, a perverse distortion of compassionate euthanasia. Others suggested he simply enjoyed killing, that the act itself provided satisfaction divorced from any comprehensible purpose. The truth likely died with Baxter's victims, locked within a psychology so alien to normal human experience that it defies complete understanding. The victims themselves, beyond statistics and case numbers, were individuals whose stories deserved remembrance. Among the estimated 400 were World War II veterans who survived combat only to be murdered in a hospital bed. There were grandmothers whose knitting needles fell silent forever. Grandfathers who would never finish the woodworking projects in their garages. Mothers who believed they would recover and return home to families waiting anxiously for their return. Teachers, shopkeepers, factory workers, homemakers, ordinary people living ordinary lives until Patrick Baxter decided their existence should conclude. Some victims had been healthy enough that discharge was imminent when Baxter killed them. Imagine the cruelty. Patients packed their belongings, made plans for return home, called families to arrange transportation, only to die hours before release. Their deaths were particularly unconscionable because they possessed futures that were viable and imminent. Baxter stole not merely years or months, but actual escape from hospitalization. These patients should have walked out alive. Instead, they were carried out dead, murdered by someone whose professional obligation was their recovery. The legal system's limitations became painfully apparent in the case's resolution. While Baxter was convicted of multiple murders, the vast majority of probable victims never received justice in the courtroom. Evidentiary challenges, degraded remains, incomplete records, passage of time, prevented prosecution of most suspected cases. This meant families never heard guilty verdicts specifically addressing their loved ones. They existed in a terrible limbo where they believed murder occurred, but the legal system could not validate that belief with formal conviction. This gap between moral certainty and legal proof represents one of the case's enduring frustrations. The possibility of undetected accomplices or knowing enablers haunted the investigation. Did anyone assist Baxter actively in killing patients? Did colleagues harbor suspicions but deliberately avoid pursuing them? Did administrators receive warnings they consciously suppressed? While no evidence emerged of active conspiracy, questions persisted about passive complicity, the turning of blind eyes, the rationalization of concerns, the institutional pressures that discouraged uncomfortable questions. These potential secondary actors, if they existed, never faced legal consequences, though they may carry private burdens of guilt. Patrick Baxter's ultimate fate. Dying in prison, his name synonymous with medical murder, his legacy one of horror, provides cold comfort to those he damaged. Justice, such as it was, arrived too late for his victims and offered incomplete satisfaction to their families. The murders themselves cannot be undone. The lives stolen cannot be restored. The trust destroyed cannot be fully rebuilt. What remains is memory, warning, and the obligation to ensure such systematic killing within medical settings never occurs again. The case stands as testament to the darkest possibilities of human nature and the catastrophic consequences when evil finds institutional camouflage. Baxter transformed healing spaces into killing fields, exploited trust as a weapon, and demonstrated that monsters do not always lurk in shadows. Sometimes they wear white coats and carry credentials that grant them access to society's most vulnerable. His crimes remind us that vigilance must be constant, that uncomfortable questions must be asked, that statistical anomalies demand investigation, and that no profession is immune to infiltration by those who seek to harm rather than help. For the estimated 400 victims of Patrick Baxter, there is no justice adequate to the crime, no punishment sufficient to balance the scales, no explanation that makes sense of senseless killing. There are only names, lives lived and stolen, families forever damaged, and the haunting knowledge that medicine's capacity to heal carries with it the terrible potential to destroy when wielded by hands driven not by compassion but by impulses we can barely comprehend and cannot adequately condemn. Their deaths demand remembrance, their stories insist upon telling, and their stolen futures obligate us to remain vigilant against those who would pervert trust into opportunity for murder. The final chapter of this horror remains incomplete because healing remains impossible. Wounds this deep never fully close. Families carry their grief and rage forward. Communities remember. And somewhere in the institutional memory of healthcare, the name Patrick Baxter exists as warning and shame, a reminder that even in places dedicated to preserving life, death can find willing servants who bring it with calculated efficiency to those least able to defend themselves. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.